Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cosy and the world, even at its strangest, is approached with a calm voice and an unhurried mind. Tonight, we're heading somewhere most visitors to London never really think about for very long, even while they walk directly above it. The city on the surface is familiar enough. Stone churches, black cabs, terraced houses, crowded stations, sudden rain, someone in a hurry carrying a paper cup and wearing the expression of a person who has already missed one train and is emotionally prepared to miss another. It feels old in the way great cities often do. Layered, worn in, slightly uneven at the edges. But London's oldest feeling may not actually come from what rises above the streets. It may come from what has been hidden below them. Because beneath the pavements and traffic lights, beneath the bookshops and pubs and office blocks and parks, there is another London. Not a myth exactly, and not quite a secret either. More like an accumulation. A place built in pieces and then covered over in more pieces. A tunnel dug for one purpose and later reused for another. A station sealed, then reopened for a different kind of life. A river forced into darkness. A shelter turned into a communication centre. A passage that begins as public infrastructure and ends up living on as local rumour. The mystery of underground London is not that no one knows anything about it. Quite the opposite. It is that so many people have known so many separate parts of it that the whole thing becomes difficult to hold in the mind at once. And that makes it, in a very particular London way, even more mysterious. Before we descend into all of that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and whether the place around you feels more like a city that grew upward, or a city that grew downward. Perhaps you're tucked into bed in a tower block, or a farmhouse, or a quiet suburban street, where the only thing under the floorboards is old wiring and a bit of dust. Or perhaps you're in a city of your own, one with basements and drains and service corridors and hidden spaces no map really captures. Whatever your corner of the world looks like, it's a lovely thing to think that we've all arrived here from different places to talk about what lies under one particular city. And if you find this journey soothing, intriguing, or simply a pleasant way to unwind, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this small and sleepy corner of curious storytelling reach other people who might enjoy a quiet wander through history before they drift off. I can't promise the tunnels beneath London will make the city seem less strange, but I can at least promise we'll take the long way there. Now, settle in, loosen your thoughts a little, and picture London at street level. At first glance, it seems solid. That is one of the most reassuring illusions a city can offer. Roads appear fixed, buildings appear rooted, stations look as though they were placed exactly where they were always meant to be. Even a city as famously patchworked as London gives off the impression that, however chaotic its traffic may be, the ground beneath it is settled and known. But that sense of certainty begins to wobble the moment you imagine slicing downward through the streets, as if the whole place were a cake made by a civil engineer with a flair for overcomplication. Just below the road surface there are cables, pipes, drains, foundations, forgotten brickwork, service ducts and all the practical innards of a functioning metropolis. Lower still, older structures appear. Cellars from vanished buildings, fragments of earlier streets, voids where construction once cut through something older and then simply carried on. Then come train tunnels, utility passages, deep shafts, ventilation routes, bricked-off platforms, sealed stairways, sections no longer needed, sections repurposed, sections kept running quietly, because modern life depends on things most of us never see. And threaded through some of this, sometimes crossed by it, sometimes swallowed into it, are older lines still. Lost watercourses, former burial grounds, medieval edges, Victorian interventions, wartime excavations, Cold War chambers, repairs on top of repairs. The result is less like one hidden network and more like a stack of intentions. That, more than anything, is what makes London Underground so compelling. We often like our mysteries neat. A secret chamber, a lost treasure, a hidden map. Something with a lid you can open and then point to and say, "Ah, there it is." London rarely behaves so tidily. Its mysteries tend to be cumulative rather than singular. One layer explains a little but also obscures what came before. A tunnel may have a clear date of construction and still sit on the line of a much older route. A chamber may be well documented in wartime records, while the ground it occupies contains traces from long before anyone imagined the Second World War. A sealed station may not be mysterious in the dramatic sense at all. Historians may know when it closed, why it closed, how it was used afterward, and yet in the public imagination it remains eerie because anything deliberately shut away begins collecting atmosphere almost immediately. Humans are very quick to become suspicious of brick walls built where doors used to be. Part of this has to do with London's age, but not in the simplified way people often mean when they say a place is old. Age by itself does not automatically create mystery. Plenty of ancient places are clear and legible. What London has is prolonged, messy continuity. It was not built once and preserved. It was built, damaged, repaired, extended, burned, rebuilt, widened, paved over, tunnelled beneath, bombed, adapted, modernised, and occasionally ignored until someone rediscovered what had been left behind. The city did not replace itself so much as pile itself up and dig itself through. If that sounds inefficient, it absolutely is. If it sounds historically rich, that too. Even above ground, London often feels like a conversation between centuries conducted through architecture. A glass tower may be looking down at a church, older than some countries. A Georgian terrace may stand on a route first used in Roman times. A railway arch may interrupt a street pattern that made perfect sense before the railway arrived and none at all after. But below ground, this layering becomes more literal. The city's practical needs and historical accidents meet in cramped, dark, damp conditions. Water had to be redirected, waste had to be carried away, goods had to be moved, people had to be sheltered, communications had to be protected, railways had to pass under crowded districts because there was no room left above. At every stage, engineers solved a problem, and in solving it often created a new space that would later acquire another purpose. It is tempting when faced with so much hidden infrastructure to imagine a master plan, a grand subterranean blueprint known only to a few stern men in long coats with keys heavy enough to damage a coffee table. But London's underworld is not the product of one mind or even one era. It is closer to a long-running practical argument between geography, necessity, money, technology, and the occasional crisis. A river gets buried because it smells terrible or obstructs development. A tunnel is dug because horses and carts cannot manage the traffic above. A deep shelter is excavated because bombing has made the ordinary surface of life feel suddenly far too exposed. A transport route closes because the city changes, and then the abandoned space remains below, like a sentence no one ever quite finished. That unfinished quality matters. It is one reason disused underground places so often capture the imagination more powerfully than functioning ones. A working tunnel, however interesting, has a purpose that disciplines our curiosity. It carries trains, it houses cables, it drains water. It may be important, but it is not narratively available. Once a place falls out of ordinary use, though, it becomes open to speculation. Silence moves in, dust settles. Rumour begins doing what rumour does best, which is filling gaps with confidence wildly disproportionate to its evidence. London is especially fertile ground for this because it combines genuine hidden complexity with a long-standing love of lore. This is a city where people will cheerfully tell you that there is a plague pit under your office, a Roman temple beneath your bank, a river under your feet, and a secret government bunker nearby, and there is a fair chance that some part of that sentence is true. Not always the part they are most certain about, but enough of it to keep the story alive. The presence of real buried things gives energy to the half-remembered ones. A city that genuinely does contain concealed stations and wartime tunnels makes every sealed door seem like the entrance to something extraordinary. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it leads to a utility cupboard and a damp disappointment. Still, even the less glamorous spaces tell a story. That may be the most quietly astonishing thing about all this. You do not need every tunnel to be dramatic for the underground city to feel immense and uncanny. In fact, the opposite may be more powerful. The mystery comes partly from repetition. How many decisions across how many generations were made below ground and then forgotten by everyone except the few whose jobs required them? How many workers descended stairs into places the public never saw, performed some crucial and uncelebrated task, and emerged again without leaving more than a line in an engineering report? How many passages were considered essential in one decade and obsolete in the next? The hidden London beneath London was not built only by visionaries and officials. It was also made by navvies, sewer workers, railway labourers, post office engineers, wartime planners, electricians, maintenance crews, and all the ordinary people who tend to vanish from simplified versions of urban history. This is perhaps why the underground city feels so dense with lives as well as structures. Even when a tunnel is empty now, it rarely feels empty in historical terms. A sealed platform suggests commuters once waiting there in coats and hats, glancing up at signs, annoyed about delays that were no doubt described as unprecedented in tones implying they were daily. A shelter suggests nights of fear, endurance, routine, tea in metal cups, conversations held under the pressure of events too large to stop. A buried river suggests centuries of change, not just in engineering, but in what a city will tolerate, exploit, conceal, and redefine as progress. Nothing under London means only one thing for very long. There is also the matter of scale. London is large enough above ground to be mentally exhausting. Below ground, it becomes more so because much of it cannot be seen in one coherent view. You can stand on a hill and understand something about a city's surface, even if only approximately. You cannot do that with its interior. The underground resists overview. It must be assembled from maps, plans, site visits, photographs, records, maintenance diagrams, oral histories, access permissions, and in some cases, educated guesswork. Historians are often very good at explaining specific layers, but the whole remains slippery because the whole was never made as one thing. A transport historian may know one group of tunnels intimately, a historian of sanitation another, a wartime specialist another. A local researcher may know every rumour attached to a particular district. Bringing those layers together is not impossible, but it requires accepting that the result will never be as clean as a single story, which is perhaps for the best. Clean stories are satisfying, but cities are not built for satisfaction. They are built for survival, trade, shelter, movement, control, convenience, and whatever else the era demands. London's underground reflects all of that. It is majestic in places, improvised in others, overbuilt here, neglected there, and always slightly more complicated than expected. It is the kind of place where one passage may represent enormous confidence in the future, and another, just a short distance away, may reveal how abruptly futures can change. Consider how often the city has had to react. Fire force rebuilding, industrial growth demanded transport, overcrowding demanded sanitation, war demanded protection and secrecy, Cold War anxiety demanded resilience and communications. Modern logistics demanded new systems under old streets. Each response left traces. None erased the previous city entirely. That is why the deeper one looks, the less London resembles a single settlement, and the more it resembles an archive compressed into soil and brick. An archive, admittedly, with more rats than most archives. And yet, for all this hidden complexity, daily life continues above with astonishing indifference. Commuters hurry over buried rivers without noticing them. Tourists photographed landmarks while standing above tunnels built for entirely different Londons. Office workers eat lunch near sealed stations whose names have faded from public memory. Buses pass over depths where wartime chambers and utility lines and old engineering ambitions remain folded into the city's underside. That contrast is part of the charm. Londoners are often said to be good at ignoring unusual things, provided they're happening in a reasonably organised manner. A forgotten chamber below the pavement qualifies perfectly. If it is not delaying a train or interrupting a takeaway order, most people are content to let it remain under somebody else's responsibility. But history has a habit of surfacing, or at least of tugging at the edges of the present. A renovation project breaks into an older space. A disused route is opened for guided tours. A newspaper runs a piece on lost stations. An urban explorer shares photographs of tiled corridors and dust-covered signs. A map of buried rivers circulates, and suddenly half the city starts suspecting there is water murmuring beneath the pub. Each rediscovery reminds people that the visible city is only the latest arrangement. Below it sits a more stubborn record of what had to be hidden, redirected, abandoned, or transformed to make London function at all. That record begins, in many ways, with water. Because before there were deep shelters or postal trains or sealed tube platforms, there were streams and marshy ground, and the far less glamorous truth that cities do not get to choose whether geography matters. They only get to decide how aggressively they intend to argue with it. London has argued with water for centuries, sometimes elegantly, sometimes with a level of civic panic that suggests everyone had reached the end of their patience and possibly their handkerchief supply. Rivers that once ran openly became nuisances, then hazards, then engineering problems to be solved by enclosure. The city above became cleaner, more buildable, more modern. The city below became darker, wetter, and considerably more complicated. And so if you want to understand the deeper mystery of London, it helps not to begin with the most dramatic chamber or the most cinematic abandoned station, but with something older and more stubborn. A watercourse that once moved in daylight and now runs hidden under streets and buildings, folded into the systems that keep the city alive while also reminding it, quietly and continuously, that the ground beneath London was never truly still. That watercourse was the River Fleet, and for a very long time it was not hidden at all. It moved openly through London as a real river with banks and bends and weather and smell, gathering smaller streams as it made its way south toward the Thames. Today it survives mostly in names, fragments, maps, and the uneasy delight of people who discover that a river still runs beneath streets they have walked 100 times without suspecting a thing. There is something especially London about that. A city can hide an entire river under roads, railway lines, offices, alleys, pubs, and apartment blocks, and then carry on as though this is an entirely reasonable thing to do. In fairness, from the city's point of view, it probably was. The Fleet once rose from springs in the higher ground to the north in what are now heavily built parts of the city, and flowed southward through a valley that shaped settlement long before modern London spread across everything. In Roman and medieval times, this was no trivial ditch. The Fleet formed a genuine feature in the landscape, broad enough in some parts to serve transport and commerce, significant enough to affect where people built, worked, crossed, dumped, traded, prayed, argued, and no doubt occasionally fell in after making optimistic decisions about ale. It passed near places that would become central to London's civic and religious life. It helped define boundaries. It provided water. It also, like many urban rivers asked to serve too many needs at once, gradually became a victim of the very city that grew around it. That is often how these stories go. A river begins as an asset, becomes a convenience, turns into a problem, and ends as infrastructure. If you picture the Fleet in its earlier days, it helps to resist the temptation to imagine some pristine ribbon of water drifting serenely through meadows, while songbirds performed their contractual obligations in nearby trees. London was never that obliging, even in earlier centuries. The river would have been useful, yes, and at times probably attractive in a practical, working sort of way, but it was also part of an urban environment that could be muddy, noisy, crowded, and remarkably creative in its handling of waste. Medieval and early modern cities had many strengths. Elegant sanitation planning was not always among them. As London expanded, the Fleet's condition worsened. Houses, workshops, and industry crowded its edges. Rubbish and refuse entered the water. So did things people preferred not to discuss in detail, which historians, having seen enough archival evidence, are generally spared the need to romanticise. The river silted up. Sections narrowed. Attempts were made at improvement. At one stage it was even canalised in parts, an effort to render it more orderly and useful, which is a very human response to a watercourse that has stopped behaving like an agreeable colleague and started behaving like a damp argument. But the larger trajectory was against it. London was getting denser. The Fleet was becoming filthier. Space was precious, and an increasingly foul river valley cutting through the city did not look like progress. By the 17th and 18th centuries, parts of the Fleet were already being covered over or confined. Bridges became buried from view as street levels changed and construction accumulated around them. Open water narrowed into channels hemmed in by masonry. What had once been a visible river began, stretch by stretch, to sink into semi-darkness. This did not happen in a single dramatic act with a villain twirling a moustache and declaring war on all flowing things. It happened through piecemeal urban change, the least theatrical and most relentless force cities possess. One wall here, one culvert there, one development pressing further over the bank, one practical scheme after another, and gradually a river that shaped the city becomes something the city would rather not look at directly. There is a sad little irony in that. Rivers often help create settlements in the first place. Then those settlements grow large enough to punish the river for being in the way. The Fleet's disappearance from ordinary sight did not mean it ceased to matter, quite the opposite. Water is famously difficult to persuade into irrelevance. Hide it, and it continues. Confine it, and it keeps flowing. Build above it, and the ground remembers. London's buried rivers, and the Fleet most famously among them, remain one of the clearest reminders that the modern city sits not on blank earth, but on altered terrain. Streets that seem merely inconvenient may follow older topographies. Dips and slopes may preserve the ghost of a valley. Sudden dampness, awkward foundations, flooding risks, strange engineering choices, all can point to earlier watercourses still active beneath the surface. A city can insist on new geometry above ground, but below, the old routes retain a stubborn sort of authority. The Fleet's course ran through what later became intensely developed districts. That is one reason it has such a grip on the imagination. This is not some lost stream under an empty field on the urban fringe. It is a river beneath central London, below roads and neighbourhoods many people know well. Farringdon, Clerkenwell, King's Cross, Holborn, Blackfriars, these are not remote or neglected locations. They are deeply woven into the daily movement of the city. To realise that beneath them a river still passes, mostly unseen, is to feel London shift slightly in the mind. The map most people carry around is suddenly incomplete, and incompleteness breeds fascination. Part of the Fleet's lingering mystery comes from the way it occupies several historical identities at once. It was once a natural river, then an urban river, then a polluted nuisance, then a managed watercourse, then a component in drainage and sewer systems. In places it has been culverted, redirected, incorporated, crossed, rebuilt around, and reinterpreted. So when people speak of the Fleet, they are not always speaking of the same physical thing in the same historical state. One person imagines an ancient river with muddy banks. Another imagines a dark brick tunnel roaring after rainfall. Another thinks of Victorian engineering. Another of a local legend, of hearing water under a grate, of maps marked with blue lines that no longer appear on the street. The Fleet survives as geography, infrastructure and folklore all at once. That is precisely the sort of layered existence London specialises in. It is also worth pausing on the sensory element, because buried rivers are not mysterious only on paper. They intrude on the senses in oddly intimate ways. People report hearing rushing water through drains or pavement gratings. In certain weather, especially after heavy rain, the invisible becomes momentarily easier to imagine. Water levels rise, channels fill, and the thought occurs that beneath the ordinary traffic there is movement, volume, pressure, something older than the road and less interested in your timetable than you are. Even when the fleet is entirely out of view, it remains dynamically present. It is not a fossil. It is still doing what rivers do, only now through masonry and engineered routes that transformed it from surface feature into subterranean fact. If this sounds slightly eerie, it should. Not because there is anything supernatural about a culverted river, but because humans have a strong instinctive response to hidden natural forces under built environments. A concealed river feels different from a buried cable. Both may be important. Only one carries with it the uneasy knowledge that it once belonged to open daylight and still possesses a form of life of its own. Water has memory in the historical imagination. Once you know a street overlies a river, that street becomes less stable in your mind, as though part of it has been borrowed from another map. The history of the fleet also tells us something broader about London's development. Cities often present infrastructure as evidence of mastery. Look, they say, we have organised the mess, we have disciplined the landscape, we have turned mud into traffic management and marsh into real estate. And on one level, yes, this is an extraordinary achievement. To take a growing metropolis with all its demands and create systems that allow millions of people to live, move, work and flush toilets with some confidence is no small matter. The burial and management of rivers were part of that story. Yet the price of mastery is often concealment. Once a river becomes part of a system, fewer people remember it as a river. It ceases to be a presence and becomes a function. The fleet resisted complete reduction, in part because it was so notorious. It was too important historically, too central, too vividly unpleasant in its polluted phases, and too physically influential to disappear entirely from memory. Old maps preserved it. Street names hinted at it. Scholars traced it. Enthusiasts followed its route across the city. Writers returned to it because a lost river under London is simply too tempting a subject to leave alone. There is a whole category of urban affection reserved for things that should by all rights be forgotten but refuse to stay forgotten. The fleet sits very comfortably there, like an elderly and rather disreputable relative whose stories are embarrassing, fascinating, and somehow central to the family identity. It is also central to understanding how London's underground became so crowded with overlapping purposes. Once a river is culverted, it creates a line through the city that future engineers must account for. Sewers may follow or intersect it. Roads bridge it invisibly. Railways cross its former valley. Foundations negotiate around its presence. Service tunnels may end up near it. In some places, the earlier natural path influences later human design, even when the designers are thinking primarily in terms of engineering constraints rather than historical inheritance. The underground city does not consist of separate clean layers stacked politely, one atop another like folded linens. It is more like a badly managed desk drawer in which every generation has added new objects without removing the old ones. The fleet, then, is not just one hidden feature among many. It is one of the templates for London's subterranean condition. It demonstrates how the city absorbs what once lay openly across it, and then forces future infrastructure to coexist with that absorption. If you want to know why London below ground feels so hard to summarise, a buried river is an excellent place to begin. It introduces all the key themes at once. Natural geography transformed by urban growth, older routes repurposed rather than erased, engineering layered on top of previous solutions, and a lingering sense that full explanation is always a little out of reach because the thing itself has changed form, so many times. That changing form is important. Historians can often explain parts of the fleet's story very clearly. They can trace its route, discuss its use, describe its degradation, situate it in urban planning, and identify the works that can find it more fully underground. But when the public asks about the mystery of the fleet, they are usually asking for more than technical history. They want to know what it feels like that a city can cover a river and still somehow remain shaped by it. They want to know how much of the old course survives intact, how much has been altered, what lies alongside it now, what the tunnel looks like in the dark, how often it floods, whether people can enter it, whether they should enter it, and why hearing about it makes familiar neighbourhoods feel slightly haunted. The answer to that last question, I think, is that buried rivers challenge our confidence in surfaces. We spend much of our lives trusting pavements, building lines, station entrances, and the visible arrangement of things. A hidden river reminds us that the visible city is an edited version. Beneath the edited version is something less tidy, more contingent, and often more interesting. London in particular invites that realisation because so much of its authority as a capital city depends on appearance. Institutions, monuments, roads full of purpose. The fleet slips under all of that with very little concern for ceremony. It is a quiet rebuke to the fantasy that cities ever become fully finished. There is another layer here as well, and that is smell, or rather the memory of smell. The fleet's history cannot be separated from the fact that polluted urban rivers become intolerable in intensely material ways. People did not decide to bury and control such waterways because abstraction demanded it. They did so because the conditions became unbearable. Rot, sewage, industrial discharge, stagnation, disease fears, and all the sensory misery of a crowded city dealing poorly with its own byproducts gathered around these watercourses. If the fleet now seems romantic in its concealment, that is partly because concealment succeeded too well. Distance allows people to become fond of what earlier generations found disgusting enough to brick over. That process would become even more pronounced in the 19th century, when London's sanitation crisis forced a far more ambitious confrontation with waste and water. But even before that larger transformation, the fleet had already become a lesson the city could no longer ignore. A natural stream turned urban drain revealed what happened when growth outpaced systems. The river, once useful, became an indictment, and once hidden, it remained as a kind of dark seam through London's history, visible only in fragments yet never fully absent. One of the most striking things about the fleet today is how ordinary the city above it can feel. You can walk near its buried course and notice nothing at all unless you already know. A cafe opens, buses hiss at a stop, someone checks their phone at a crossing, delivery vans unload, office workers negotiate lunch. The city performs normality with total confidence, while a river continues beneath it in confinement. There is something almost comic in that contrast. London can make the extraordinary seem routine, so long as it has had enough time to build around it. This may be one of the capital's greatest talents. If tomorrow someone announced that there was a medieval cellar, a Victorian pipe network, and a wartime chamber under the average sandwich shop, many Londoners would probably nod and ask whether it affected opening hours. And yet, once noticed, the buried fleet is hard to unnotice. It changes the city's emotional texture. Suddenly, slopes have reasons. Place names have depth. The map becomes perforated by unseen movement. You begin to sense that London is not merely built on history in the usual commemorative sense, with plaques and statues and well-behaved museum labels. It is built on active, hidden continuities. The fleet still flows. It does not care whether most people remember its older life. It does not require public admiration. It is simply there, incorporated into the city's underside, a survivor in altered form. That altered survival makes it an ideal threshold subject for everything else below London. Once you accept that a river can be buried and still shape the city, the rest of the underground begins to feel more plausible. Of course, there would be tunnels serving purposes few people above ever think about. Of course, passages would change function over time. Of course, secrecy and neglect and reinvention would leave strange residues. The fleet prepares the imagination for a London beneath London by showing that the hidden city did not begin with trains or bunkers. It began when geography itself was driven underground and forced to coexist with what came later. And later, London would produce systems even more deliberately subterranean. Not a river hidden because urban growth made it inconvenient, but a railway designed from the start to move unseen beneath the streets, carrying something essential, ordinary, and surprisingly intimate through the city's lower darkness. Mail, after all, is one of those things that feels mundane until you picture the machinery required to move it reliably through a metropolis. Then it starts to seem almost magical. Once London had begun forcing its rivers into culverts, drains, and confined channels, it had also begun creating a new kind of underground city, one not built for mystery or romance, but for sheer survival. The buried river fleet was part of that transformation, but it was only one thread in a much larger and increasingly urgent problem. Because by the 19th century, London was no longer a city that could muddle through on older arrangements and local fixes. It had become too large, too crowded, too industrial, too confident in its own expansion, and unfortunately far too willing to treat moving water as a convenient place to send things it no longer wished to see again. That strategy, perhaps unsurprisingly, had limits. If you want to understand why so much of London's hidden world took the shape it did, you have to picture the city in the mid-19th century not as the polished capital of tourist postcards, but as a vast and overburdened organism straining under the weight of its own success. Population growth had been dramatic, housing was dense, industry was active, streets were crowded with people, animals, carts, smoke, noise and waste, in forms both ordinary and alarming. The Thames, which should have been the city's grand river, had become in many stretches an open receiver of filth. Smaller rivers and streams, including the Fleet and others like it, had already been degraded, confined, or absorbed into drainage channels and sewers. The old systems, where they existed, were patchy and inadequate. Some sewers had originally been built to carry rainwater rather than human waste. Others were simply too small for the city now pressing upon them. Countless cesspits and drains leaked or overflowed. Effluent found its way into waterways with grim reliability. London, in other words, was not so much managing its waste as redistributing it with misplaced optimism. It is easy from a modern distance to speak calmly about 19th century sanitation, but the daily experience must have been extraordinary in the least pleasant sense of the word. Smells were powerful and constant. Water supplies could be contaminated. Disease moved through crowded districts. The city's relationship with water had become deeply confused. Rivers that once sustained settlement were now entangled with sewage and runoff. Rain, instead of simply cleaning the streets, could overload drains and carry more waste toward already suffering channels. To modernise, the solution seems obvious. Separate the foul water, control the discharge, and build at a scale commensurate with the population. But obvious solutions are rarely easy when a city has grown unevenly for centuries and is standing on its own historical clutter. For a long time, London did what many large systems do before reform. It tolerated what it could, improvised where necessary, argued over responsibility, and continued operating until the problem became impossible to ignore. Then came the summer of 1858, and the city was forced into a level of attention it would very much have preferred to avoid. This was the episode later known as the Great Stink, and it remains one of the most memorably named public health crises in urban history, which is fitting because if a city is going to be driven into engineering revolution by smell, the least it can do is be direct about it. During an especially hot summer, the already polluted Thames became unbearable. High temperatures intensified this, stench rising from the river, which had become thick with sewage and other waste. The smell was not merely unpleasant in the ordinary sense, it was overpowering, invasive, and politically impossible to dismiss when it reached the very institutions meant to govern the nation. Curtains soaked in chemicals were reportedly hung at the Houses of Parliament in an attempt to block it out, which is a wonderfully British image. An empire at the height of its global confidence attempting to defeat a sanitation crisis with scented fabric. The fabric did not solve it. Now, to be fair to the people of the time, they were operating within a medical understanding that was still evolving. Many believed strongly in miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air or foul-smelling vapours. We now know that waterborne pathogens played a central role in outbreaks such as cholera, and that smell itself was not the direct mechanism of transmission. But even where the theory was incomplete, the practical conclusion was not entirely wrong. The filth had to be dealt with. The river was dangerous, offensive, and symptomatic of a city that had outgrown its own internal plumbing by several million people. One did not need modern microbiology to recognise that things had gone badly off course. The Great Stink mattered not simply because it was disgusting, though it certainly was, but because it compressed years of civic failure into a crisis impossible for the political class to ignore. Problems tolerated in poorer districts had risen, quite literally, into the noses of those with the power to authorise large-scale change. London had reached the point where its hidden waterways and waste systems were no longer obscure technical matters. They were a constitutional inconvenience, and history shows that societies will often endure terrible conditions for years, but the moment those conditions begin interrupting legislative comfort, remarkable energy can suddenly be found. Into this moment stepped Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, whose name deserves to be spoken with the tone one might reserve for someone who saved a city using brick, gradients, and an almost heroic refusal to think small. Bazalgette did not invent the idea of improving London's drainage all by himself, nor was he working in a vacuum, but he became the central figure in designing and implementing the great network of intercepting sewers that transformed the capital's relationship with waste and water. The brilliance of the plan lay not in some theatrical subterranean flourish, but in its scale, logic, and practical ambition. Instead of allowing countless local sewers to continue discharging directly into the Thames within central London, the new system would intercept much of that flow and carry it eastward, downstream of the main built-up areas. This required not one neat tunnel, but a vast coordinated network. Main sewers, subsidiary sewers, pumping stations, embankments, connections, gradients, brick-lined arteries running beneath and beside the city, all designed to move immense quantities of foul water out of central areas with a reliability older arrangements could not achieve. It is one of those engineering achievements that can seem dull only if one has never really considered what it means to build a functioning city for millions of people who are all, regrettably but quite consistently, engaged in biological processes. And this is where London's underground begins to feel less like a place of isolated wonders and more like a second metropolis built to support the visible one. Bazalgette's works did not merely solve a smell, they reorganised subterranean space on a civilizational scale. Rivers, drains, culverts, and older channels became part of a far larger and more disciplined system. The buried fleet, along with other covered watercourses, would increasingly exist within a city that now treated underground movement of water and waste as a matter of grand engineering rather than local improvisation. The tunnels that swallowed the water were not metaphorical. They were actual brick-built passages, large enough in some places to walk through, carrying away what the modern city could no longer tolerate in open form. The scale can be difficult to picture because most of us experience sewers conceptually rather than physically, which is a mercy, but it is worth trying. Imagine miles upon miles of subterranean routes built with careful attention to fall, flow, durability, maintenance access, and the practical realities of a city still growing while the work was underway. Imagine workers digging, lining, measuring, building, often in difficult and dangerous conditions, to create channels that most future citizens would never see and ideally never have to think about. Imagine the confidence required to invest in infrastructure whose success would consist largely in the public no longer noticing certain kinds of catastrophe. There is a quiet nobility in that sort of work. No triumphal arch, no palace facade, just a system that prevents horror from becoming routine. Bazalgette also oversaw the creation of the Great Thames embankments, which combined roadways and public space with concealed infrastructure. This is another very London touch. The city often prefers to hide its hardest practical decisions inside something architecturally respectable. Beneath embankments that helped reshape the riverfront ran sewers and other services, including parts of the new drainage system. The visible city gained dignified river edges and improved roads. The invisible city gained conduits of immense importance. Beauty above, necessity below. It is a pairing London has never entirely abandoned. And yet, for all the order imposed by the new system, the older geography did not simply vanish. The buried rivers remained present within the city's lower anatomy. Some became feeders to larger systems. Some ran in culverts that interacted with sewers. Some continued to complicate engineering decisions because water never stops being itself merely because bureaucracy has drawn lines over it. This is part of what makes historians cautious when describing what lies beneath London. A single tunnel may belong to one phase of construction and one administrative purpose, yet occupy ground shaped by much earlier hydrology and cut across by later works. What appears on a modern plan as a clean line may in reality sit within a crowded historical argument between river valley, sewer route, railway cutting, and utility corridor. So when people talk about tunnels that swallowed the water, the phrase is not just dramatic, though it is pleasingly dramatic. It describes a real historical process in which London enclosed, redirected and systematized water on a massive scale. Open channels disappeared. Surface nuisances became subterranean flows. The city increasingly treated water not as landscape but as throughput. This made urban life healthier and more manageable, but it also deepened the sense that beneath London lay a hidden territory of functional darkness, a place where older natural forms had been translated into engineered ones. The contrast between above and below grew sharper. On the surface, London advanced into modernity with all the self-importance one would expect. Railways expanded, commerce accelerated, new buildings rose. Imperial confidence thickened the air almost as effectively as coal smoke. Below ground, meanwhile, the city was labouring to keep itself from poisoning its own future. There is something very instructive in that. Great capitals often like to tell stories about power, culture, and national destiny. Much less often do they admit that their survival depended on someone building enormous tunnels so their waste stopped fermenting in public rivers. Still, if you listen carefully to London's history, those tunnels are speaking all the time. They speak in the absence of older smells, in the reduction of certain diseases, in the changing relationship between the city and the Thames, in the possibility of later underground projects that could only be attempted in a metropolis already habituated to large-scale excavation and hidden infrastructure. Once a city learns to build beneath itself with confidence, it becomes easier to imagine doing so for other purposes. Sewers do not automatically lead to secret wartime headquarters or private railways, of course, but they do establish a certain civic grammar. They normalise the idea that the real working city extends far below the polite one, that grammar would shape the public imagination as much as the physical ground. Victorian engineering had a powerful effect on how Londoners came to think about what could exist unseen beneath their feet. Large brick tunnels, pumping stations, covered rivers, buried culverts, deep drains, service conduits, all of this contributed to a sense that the city below was both knowable and inaccessible. The authorities knew things, engineers knew things, utility workers knew things. Ordinary citizens knew just enough to be curious and not enough to feel satisfied. This is excellent fuel for urban myth and lasting fascination. tell people that beneath the pavement lies a vast tunnel carrying an invisible force away into darkness, and they will become, very reasonably, interested. The practical transformation also had unintended aesthetic consequences. Buried rivers and major sewers occupy an odd place in cultural imagination, because they are at once revolting and compelling. Nobody wants their drinking water contaminated. Nobody wishes for a return to the conditions that produced the Great Stink. And yet, once the crisis has passed and the engineering has become part of inherited city fabric, people begin to wonder. What do these places look like? How large are they? Can you hear them? Which route does the water follow now? Where does the old river go? What else was built alongside it later? The same human mind that sensibly prefers sanitation also harbours a deep curiosity about forbidden brick tunnels under major capitals. This curiosity grows stronger because sewers and culverts are among the least publicly visible forms of grand infrastructure. A railway announces itself with stations, tracks, signs, passengers, delays, complaints, and occasionally a sandwich of uncertain age discovered under a seat. A sewer, when functioning properly, expresses itself mostly by not being a catastrophe. Its success is silent. That silence leaves room for imagination. The hidden work seems larger because it is hidden. The darkness seems deeper because it is not designed for public inspection. And the historical link between buried rivers and modern sewers means that London's water story remains permanently half technical and half ghostly. You can see this in the way people talk about the Fleet and other lost rivers even now. They do not describe them only as hydrological features. They describe them as secret presences, hidden currents, forgotten waterways, as though they were half memory and half mechanism. Bazalgette's great sewers intensified that feeling by providing the larger framework into which these earlier waters were absorbed. The city did not simply hide a few streams. It reorganized the relationship between waste, water, and urban life so thoroughly that entire landscapes were translated into infrastructure. And yet that translation was never complete in emotional terms. A buried river is still a river in the imagination, however much it has been culverted, controlled, or linked with drainage works. A sewer built on a colossal scale remains, in one sense, a sewer, but in another it becomes part of the mythic undercity, a place of arches, darkness, echoes, ladders, access hatches, maintenance chambers, and unseen movement. Once London had built such a network, it was no longer merely a city with underground elements. It was a city whose underside had become one of its defining truths. It's also worth noting that the engineering itself was overbuilt in a way that later generations came to appreciate deeply. Bazalgette, wisely suspicious of creating a system that would be instantly too small for a growing metropolis, designed with substantial capacity in mind. This was not extravagance, it was foresight. London continued to expand, and the decision to build bigger than immediate need justified itself again and again. There is something almost moving about that in the context of urban history. So much infrastructure is designed just barely enough, and then spent decades apologising for its own inadequacy. Bazalgette's network was generous by comparison, like a man who understood both the scale of the problem and the tendency of cities to become more troublesome than expected. One can only imagine what he would make of modern rush hour. By the later 19th century then, London had acquired not just improved sanitation, but a new kind of subterranean order. Water and waste were being handled through major concealed systems. Embankments had reshaped the riverfront. The old chaos had not vanished entirely, because cities never attain perfection, and water remained stubborn, but the terms of the struggle had changed. The underground was now a place of engineered confidence as well as inherited complication. That matters, because it set the stage for another phase in the city's descent below ground, one driven not by foulness or disease, but by speed, efficiency, and the peculiar logistical challenges of moving enormous quantities of something far more respectable than sewage. Letters, parcels, correspondence, all the paper life of a great capital still had to get from one place to another, and surface streets were becoming increasingly crowded. Once again, London looked below, not to hide what it disliked, but to move what it valued. The result would be one of the strangest and most quietly charming transport systems the city ever built. A private underground railway running in the dark beneath the traffic, carrying the day's post through a city already well practiced in keeping essential things out of sight. After London learned to bury foul water and drive it through great brick arteries out of sight, it also learned something else about itself. The city had become comfortable with the idea that the most important parts of modern life did not always need to happen in daylight. Some things could move better underground. Some systems worked more efficiently when they were hidden from weather, traffic, and ordinary interruption. Once that logic took hold, it was only a matter of time before someone looked at the chaos of London streets and thought, quite sensibly, that even the post might do better below. There is something wonderfully specific about that solution. Not soldiers, not passengers, not freight in the grand industrial sense, but letters, parcels, bags of correspondence, the daily paper pulse of a huge city. Mail is one of those things that can seem almost invisible when it works well. A letter arrives, a package appears, a business receives papers it depends on, a family gets news. Nobody stands in reverent silence and says, "How extraordinary that this envelope completed a logistical journey through one of the busiest capitals on earth. Mostly we just open it and complain if it was late." But for a city like London, moving the post quickly and reliably was never a trivial matter. It was an essential function, and by the early 20th century the streets above were becoming too congested for comfort. The answer was the post office, London, Underground Railway, later known simply as Mail Rail. The basic facts are charming enough on their own. Mail Rail ran beneath London from 1927 until 2003. It consisted of 6.5 miles of tunnels at an average depth of about 70 feet, and it connected sorting offices across the city from Paddington in the west to Whitechapel in the east. There were 8 stations on the system, with Mount Pleasant serving as its largest hub. On paper it sounds oddly modest, like a practical little footnote in the history of transport. In reality, it was one of the most unusual railways London ever possessed, a private underground line built not for the public, but for the city's correspondence, moving under the streets with very little ceremony and even less public visibility. And that invisibility is part of why it still feels so intriguing. A public railway announces itself. It has entrances, tickets, crowds, maps, delays, escalators, and the general air of organised inconvenience familiar to all urban life. Mailrail had none of that for ordinary Londoners. Most people above ground had no reason to think about it at all. Their letters vanished into the postal system and emerged elsewhere, as though the city had quietly swallowed them and then changed its mind. Underneath, however, those letters were being whisked along by small electric trains through tunnels specifically designed for speed and separation from the traffic-clogged streets above. The city had built a secret railway of routine. That phrase sounds dramatic, but it is exactly what made it so London. The extraordinary was hidden in the service of the ordinary. The railway had been conceived because surface movement was too unreliable. Roads were crowded and delays could be made worse by fog and general street congestion. London was already a city where time could be lost in layers. Horses, carts, trams, cabs, motor traffic, pedestrians, streetworks, weather, all of it competing for room. Post had to cross that confusion every day. So instead of allowing letters and parcels to struggle through the city's upper chaos, the post office created its own lower route, one isolated from traffic and engineered for consistency. There is a quiet confidence in that decision, the confidence of an era that believed the right tunnel could solve almost anything. Sometimes, to be fair, it could. Mail rail was also, by the Postal Museum's account, the first electric railway with driverless trains, which makes it sound unexpectedly futuristic for something devoted to sacks of mail. The line later became known as Mail Rail in 1987, but long before the new name, its underlying idea already felt a little ahead of its time: automated movement in a concealed system, optimised not for human comfort but for function. No passengers to reassure, no windows to admire, no scenery to soften the journey. Just vehicles doing a job in narrow tunnels under a sleeping, shopping, shouting, rain-dodging city. It is one of those moments in history when a piece of infrastructure seems more modern than the culture around it. Londoners above were still dealing with all the usual surface frustrations, while below them tiny driverless trains were carrying the post with clipped underground efficiency. The physical design helped give the system its peculiar character. The main tunnel ran in a compact tube, and near stations the route split into narrower single-track sections that opened out again into station tunnels. The stations themselves were at shallower depth than the main line, reached by gradients that helped trains slow as they arrived and accelerate as they departed. It was all very practical, very engineered, and in its own way rather elegant. This was not grandeur in the style of a great terminus with arches and ironwork. It was a smaller, tighter, more secret elegance. The elegance of a machine built for repetitive usefulness. Even the dimensions make you imagine a world in miniature, a reduced-scale tube designed by someone who loved logistics more than spectacle. That miniature quality matters to the mythology of the place. People who descend into hidden infrastructure often report the same thing. It feels both larger and smaller than expected. Larger because the public rarely imagines the true extent of what lies below. Smaller because once you are there, many systems are compressed, practical, stripped of decorative comfort. Mail rail embodies both sensations at once. It was a substantial railway network, and yet one built around tiny trains and compact tunnels. That contrast gives it a slightly dreamlike quality in memory. Not a vast underworld in the Gothic sense, but a neat and tireless little machine city under the actual city, where the main cargo was envelopes rather than grand secrets. And somehow that makes it more endearing, not less. It also says something important about London's underground history more broadly. Not every hidden tunnel was born from fear, crisis, or wartime necessity. Some were built because the city needed to keep functioning with as little friction as possible. That distinction matters. If the buried rivers and great sewers reveal London solving problems of filth and public health, Mail Rail reveals London solving a problem of efficiency. The city was not just hiding things it disliked. It was also hiding processes it valued. The underground was becoming a place where essential urban systems could be insulated from the nuisance of the surface. Once again, London was creating a second city below, not out of mystery for mystery's sake, but because modern life kept demanding protected routes of its own. There is a certain comedy in imagining the streets above while all this was happening below. On the surface, London continued being London. Traffic grumbled, weather interfered, people hurried, horses gave way to motor vehicles, and every generation felt the city had become impossibly crowded compared with the sensible days of 5 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, down in the tunnels, the post went on its way in comparative peace. It is one of the loveliest recurring themes in London history that the more chaotic the surface becomes, the more attractive the underground begins to look. Not necessarily because it is pleasant down there, but because at least nobody is trying to reverse a delivery cart into you while discussing Parliament at full volume. The secrecy of Mail Rail was also unusually gentle. A wartime bunker keeps secrets because it must. A secure communications tunnel keeps secrets because governments prefer not to publish blueprints for national vulnerability. Mail Rail kept secrets because it was busy. It was not designed to feel legendary. It was designed to move post. And yet hidden utility has a way of becoming romantic once the public gets a glimpse of it. The very fact that most Londoners never rode on this railway made it more alluring later. It belonged to the category of hidden systems that were real, extensive, and strangely intimate. After all, these were not abstract goods passing underground. These were letters between people, bills, invitations, bad news, good news, dull paperwork, love letters, official notices, parcels, postcards from elsewhere, all travelling through darkness on behalf of lives unfolding above. That human element is easy to underestimate. Transport history often gravitates toward passengers because passengers are visible and talkative and tend to leave behind photographs of themselves looking determined on platforms. Mail has no such vanity, but correspondence may reveal more about a city than many commuters do. It records administration, commerce, private feeling, family connection, bureaucracy, grief, celebration, routine. To imagine those written lives moving beneath London is to understand mail rail not as a quirky novelty, but as part of the city's emotional infrastructure. It carried the paperwork of empire and the small personal messages of ordinary people alike. Somewhere in its tunnels passed legal notices, Christmas cards, official forms, awkward apologies, insurance documents, and perhaps the occasional letter that should really have remained a draft. The underworld was busy with human consequence. Its long working life also deepens the fascination. Mail rail was not some failed experiment that flashed briefly and vanished. It operated for 76 years, from 1927 to 2003. That means it endured through depression, war, reconstruction, austerity, post-war modernization, late 20th century change, and the beginning of the digital age. All that time, beneath a city repeatedly remade above ground, this quiet railway continued carrying post. That kind of continuity gives hidden places a special weight. They become witnesses. Streets changed. Buildings rose and fell. Londoners hurried over the top of the same route without thinking about it. Down below, the trains kept going. And then, like so many pieces of infrastructure, it ran into the cold arithmetic of modern efficiency. Royal Mail said the railway was closed in 2003 because using it had become far more expensive than moving the same mail by road. There is something almost melancholy about that. A system once built precisely to escape the limitations of the streets was eventually defeated by a change calculation about cost and logistics. That is the fate of many remarkable urban systems. They are born as elegant answers to one era's problem and judged obsolete by another era that values different forms of speed and flexibility. The hidden line that once represented modernity was mothballed because modernity had moved on. Still, closure tends to make places more mythic, not less. Once a route stops operating, silence enters the story. Dust arrives. Doors stay shut longer. People begin to ask what remains down there. A functioning tunnel is a system. A closed tunnel is a proposition to the imagination. This is why abandoned and sealed spaces under London so often gain power in the public mind. They are no longer just useful. They are suspended. They seem to wait. Mail rail, after 2003, became part of that wider hidden London of disused but not erased places, part machine memory and part urban legend. Even when the facts were available, the atmosphere changed. A railway for letters became a ghost railway of letters, and that sounds like the sort of phrase a city should probably be quite proud of. Its afterlife has been unusually generous. Part of the old network reopened to the public as a museum attraction in 2017, allowing visitors to descend and experience a small section of what had once been closed working infrastructure. That is an important turn in the history of London's tunnels. The city has often had hidden spaces, but not always a willingness to interpret them publicly. When a place like Mail Rail becomes visitable, even in limited form, it changes category. It remains subterranean and unusual, but it no longer belongs only to rumour, archival photographs, and engineering memory. It becomes narratable in a new way. People can point to it, ride a small section of it and come back saying, with the satisfaction peculiar to London, Yes, I went under the city and it was smaller than expected, but considerably more interesting. What makes Mail Rail especially important in the larger story is that it shows how many kinds of hidden London can coexist. Beneath the streets, there were not only buried rivers and sewers, but also purpose-built transport systems entirely separate from public life. A person walking through central London in the 20th century might have been above a culverted watercourse, near a great sewer, crossing a tube line, and passing over an underground postal railway all at once without realising any of it. That is the true scale of the city's layering. The mystery is not a single secret chamber. It is the accumulated fact that so many specialised worlds were built under the same few square miles. Mail Rail also feels like a bridge between eras. It belonged to the age of letters, but it anticipated automation. It was utilitarian, but it now feels almost quaint. It was hidden, but not sinister. It was modern, but now historical. Few underground systems carry so many tonal contradictions so comfortably. Perhaps that is why people respond to it with such affection. It is not merely an engineering curiosity. It is a reminder that cities once built invisible mechanisms to protect the movement of things we still think of as personal. The railway below was there so that the written life above could keep flowing. In a city famous for grand institutions and monumental facades, there is something pleasingly modest about one of its hidden marvels being dedicated to post. And once you begin looking for that sort of hidden repurposing, it becomes easier to notice another pattern beneath London. Some spaces were built for one use, and later given a second life far stranger than the first. A station could open for commuters, fail to attract enough of them, close, and then return during wartime as something secret and strategic. A piece of ordinary transport infrastructure could become, under pressure, a room for power. That shift from everyday purpose to concealed importance may be one of the most London transformations of all, and nowhere does it show itself more neatly than in the sealed station at Down Street, where a quiet failure on the tube acquired a second career in the dark. By the time London had learned to hide rivers, redirect sewage, and send the post quietly through its own private railway below the streets, it had also created a new kind of urban afterlife. Not every station that closed beneath the city truly disappeared. Some stopped serving passengers and then began a second existence almost immediately. Others lingered in partial use, as storage spaces, shelters, technical sites, or simply sealed off fragments of a network that had moved on without quite letting go. That is one of the most quietly unsettling things about London Underground history. A station may cease to be public, but that does not mean it becomes absent. It may remain there in the dark, no longer listed on maps, no longer announced over trains, yet still structurally present, still useful to someone, still threaded into the city's hidden logic. Down Street is one of the clearest examples. It opened in 1907 on what is now the Piccadilly line, in Mayfair between Hyde Park Corner and Dover Street, the station now known as Green Park. It was never especially successful. The surrounding area was relatively affluent, neighbouring stations were very close by, and passenger numbers stayed low enough that many trains eventually passed through without stopping. In 1932, after years of weak usage and amid service changes intended to speed up journeys, the station closed to the public. On paper, that might sound straightforward enough. One small, underused station, opened, struggled, closed. A footnote. But London rarely leaves such places alone for long. Even in its first life, Down Street had a certain accidental strangeness. It belonged to that early phase of tube expansion, when companies built with optimism and occasionally a slightly shaky sense of how many people would actually use a given stop. Some stations flourished, some became indispensable, some ended up in the awkward position of being technically available yet not quite necessary, rather like a decorative chair in a guest room that no one sits on, but everyone feels mildly guilty removing. Down Street, like Brompton Road and a few others, suffered from being too near its neighbours and not near enough to heavy demand. When Hyde Park Corner and Dover Street were improved and their access arrangements changed, Down Street's already limited reason for existing weakened further. It closed on 21st May 1932, and yet almost as soon as it ceased being a passenger station, its spaces began shifting toward new purposes. That is the pattern that matters. In London, closure often meant transformation rather than erasure. Down Street's platforms and passages did not vanish, because public need had vanished. They remained physically available within a city that was already learning the value of concealed, protected, and adaptable underground space. Once a station existed, with tunnels, lift shafts, circulation areas, and depth below the street, it became a potential answer to questions no one had asked when it first opened. Where might one place equipment? Where might one create secure storage? Where might officials work or shelter if the city above became dangerous? A station built for commuters could become a bunker with less imagination than one might think. All it really needed was a change sentry. The change sentry arrived quickly enough. In 1938, the Railway Executive Committee was established to coordinate Britain's mainline railways in wartime, and Down Street's disused but well-positioned spaces became increasingly attractive. During the Second World War, the station was converted into a protected underground headquarters for the committee, with offices, meeting rooms, sleeping accommodation, and supporting facilities built into the old station environment. Winston Churchill also used Down Street as a temporary safe refuge during periods of bombing. This wartime second life is what transformed Down Street from a mildly unsuccessful station into one of London's most famous hidden sites. It had failed in public transport and succeeded in secrecy. That is quite a respectable recovery by any building standards. There is something very London about that conversion. Not just the practical reuse, but the tone of it. If a disused station is available, properly sheltered, and inconveniently invisible, of course it may end up housing railway command functions and sheltering the Prime Minister. The city has always had a knack for taking ordinary infrastructure and, under pressure, turning it into something with a far more serious job description. Down Street was not built as a glamorous secret headquarters in the style of a spy thriller. It became one because it was there, because it was below ground, because it could be adapted, and because war turns all spare space into a strategic possibility. The romance came later. At the time, what mattered was that the place was bomb-resistant, discreet, and linked to a network vital to national life. And this is where the idea of stations that never truly closed becomes useful. Down Street certainly closed to passengers. No one sensible should pretend otherwise, but passenger service is only one kind of life a station can have. Once the public left, another set of occupants arrived. The rooms changed, equipment moved in. The site acquired a different rhythm. Instead of commuters glancing at watches and wondering why the train smelled faintly of damp wool, there were officials, communications, wartime meetings, and the peculiar intensity that comes with trying to manage national rail movement while bombs are falling over the capital. The station had not died. It had become private, hidden, and much more consequential than it had ever been as a stop on the line. That shift also says something larger about the underground itself. During wartime, London's transport network did not simply continue operating as best it could. It became shelter, storage, command infrastructure, and psychological support all at once. Some stations protected civilians, some accommodated secret work, some tunnels stored objects considered too valuable to leave exposed above ground. Aldwych, for example, closed temporarily during the Blitz, and was used both as an air raid shelter and as a storage place for treasures from the British Museum, including the Elgin marbles. In the First World War, the disused platform there had already sheltered around 300 paintings from the National Gallery. Brompton Road, another disused Piccadilly line station, later served as the command centre for the 26th London Anti-Aircraft Brigade. So Down Street was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a broader wartime pattern in which disused stations and tunnels became useful again, in roles nobody had imagined when tickets were first sold there. Once you notice that pattern, London's abandoned stations begin to look less like ghosts and more like reserves. They are dormant spaces in a city that repeatedly discovers new needs. Some are too awkward or too damaged to matter much. Others become ideal because they are deep, central and already engineered for subterranean life. A platform built for waiting can hold bunks. A tunnel intended for trains can store art. A lift shaft can be repurposed as part of a command centre. A disused station building above ground can carry on looking oddly ordinary while below, an entirely different history accumulates. This makes London's transport archaeology unusually dense. Each closure is not simply an ending. It is also a point at which the city may decide, with admirable lack of sentimentality, that the site should now do something else. It also helps explain why these places feel so powerful in the imagination. People tend to call them ghost stations, which is understandable but slightly misleading. The term suggests emptiness, whereas the more interesting truth is that many were never entirely empty at all. They passed from one mode of occupation to another. Even when they were not actively reused on the scale of Down Street, they often remained accessible to engineers, maintenance crews or planners. The public absence made them feel more haunted than they really were. A station still connected to running tunnels, still listed in internal documents, still entered occasionally by staff, is not truly lost. It is simply outside ordinary civic experience. Mystery grows very well in that sort of exclusion. Down Street's surface building contributes to this effect. It survives in Mayfair, close to Down Street's junction with Piccadilly, its red glazed facade still recognisable as one of those early underground buildings designed in the company's house style. To most passers-by, it does not announce former secret wartime station with any great urgency. This is one of London's favourite tricks. It allows significant historical spaces to look almost impolite in their restraint. You can pass a building knowing nothing, while below lies a story involving failed passenger forecasts, wartime railway command, and Churchill taking refuge underground. The city is very good at hiding drama behind respectable brick and terracotta. There is also a subtler emotional reason these stations linger in memory. Passenger stations are public by design. People move through them anonymously but together. They are places of routine, delay, boredom, relief, irritation, and all the other small urban feelings that collect around transport. When such a place closes, it leaves behind architecture designed for human expectation. Corridors imply movement. Platforms imply waiting. Signs imply instruction. Once those functions stop, the leftover space feels oddly charged because it still appears to expect people. That is why photographs of disused stations are so compelling, even when nothing dramatic is happening in them. The absence sits in a structure built for presence. A sealed platform says, very quietly, someone was supposed to be here. London has many such places. Some survive as fragments in the modern network, visible only to staff or on special tours. Some have become famous through film because they provide period detail without too much modern interference. Aldwych in particular has enjoyed a busy afterlife as a filming location, which is itself another kind of reuse. A station can fail as transport and prosper as atmosphere. That sounds unfair until one remembers how many actors have probably had more successful careers playing police officers in old tunnels than some stations ever had selling tickets. But the larger point remains. Closed underground spaces often continue to work, whether for logistics, heritage, emergency use, culture, or controlled public access. Closure is rarely as final underground as it sounds on paper. The existence of tours now at places like Down Street and Aldwych adds another layer to the story. London Transport Museum's Hidden London programme has made some of these spaces publicly interpretable again, not as active stations but as historical environments. Down Street has been open for guided exploration since 2016 through that programme. That is a remarkable turn. a station once hidden enough to shelter wartime command work has become, in carefully managed form, a place where modern visitors can descend and hear about the very secrecy that once defined it. It does not make the site less mysterious. If anything, it sharpens the mystery by replacing rumour with texture. You see the scale, the confined passages, the odd adaptations, the surviving traces of changed purpose. And then you emerge back into London with the slightly altered feeling that many ordinary addresses may be standing over histories far more complicated than their storefronts suggest. Down Street also reveals something about wartime London that is easy to flatten into cliché. We often imagine the Blitz as a story of stoicism above ground, rubble, sirens, searchlights, tea, fire-watching, speeches, newspapers insisting everything would be manageable, provided one continued behaving sensibly. All of that has its place. But there was also a deep city of response below ground, made up of shelters, command spaces, improvised dormitories, protected routes, and adapted transport infrastructure. Down Street belonged to that lower wartime city. So did stations where civilians slept on platforms, where tunnels stored national collections, where old transport space became strategic depth. The Underground was not just a railway under wartime London, it was one of the architectures through which wartime London endured itself. And because the city had already spent decades layering new systems over old ones, the reuse of stations felt almost natural. London had experience at this by then. It had buried rivers, great sewers, special purpose railways, and disused passenger spaces waiting for reinterpretation. One can almost sense the habit forming. If the surface becomes difficult, go lower. If an old structure still exists, adapt it. If a tunnel is there, it may yet prove useful. This is not romanticism so much as municipal instinct. The city below had become a bank of possibilities. Down Street was one withdrawal from that account. Brompton Road was another, Aldwych another again. Each case differed, but together they show how flexible underground London could be under pressure. What historians can explain quite well then is the sequence. Opened, underused, closed, adapted, repurposed, remembered. But what remains harder to explain fully is the feeling these spaces produce. Why does a disused station interest people more than many active ones? Why does a sealed entrance in a wealthy district seem more suggestive than a public platform full of commuters? Partly it is because hidden infrastructure feels like privileged knowledge. To know about Down Street is to feel you have gained access to a second map of London, one that sits behind the official one. Partly it is because these places preserve interrupted time. The architecture belongs to one moment, the reuse to another, the later myth to a third. And partly it is because cities are most revealing where they stop pretending to be tidy. A reused station shows adaptation in plain terms. It tells you London keeps everything it can and gives old spaces new jobs when history becomes inconvenient. This is why the phrase "stations that never truly closed" works best as an idea rather than a strict technical claim. Down Street closed to passengers, Brompton Road closed to passengers, Aldwych eventually closed to passengers, yet each persisted in some other mode, whether strategic, cultural, practical, or symbolic. Even the ones that became mostly still retained presence. Their tunnels remained in the network's memory. Their surface buildings mark the street. Their stories attach themselves to maps, photographs, television programs, museum archives, and the general London habit of discovering that the place you thought was straightforward has a sealed staircase behind it and a much stranger biography below. And once stations had begun serving war in these hidden ways, the logic could go deeper still. Not just reusing existing platforms and tunnels, but excavating spaces specifically for protection, specifically for nights when the danger above became too great and ordinary shelter would not do. London was about to build a far more deliberate undercity for civilians, one dug much deeper than a closed station platform and designed from the beginning for the possibility that thousands of people might need to wait out the dark well below the streets. If the disused stations beneath London suggested that the city could adapt what it already had, the deep-level shelters revealed something more deliberate. Sometimes reuse was not enough. Sometimes a platform or passageway could help, but the scale of danger demanded fresh excavation, deeper planning, thicker walls, more stairs, more bunks, more toilets, more ventilation, more of everything that turns a hole in the ground into a place where human beings might endure the night with something resembling order. That was the logic that carried London farther down, not just below the streets in the ordinary underground sense, but down to around 30 metres, into specially built shelter tunnels intended to hold thousands of people, while the war above carried on doing its worst. The pressure for that deeper world did not begin in a boardroom. It began when Londoners, faced with bombing in the autumn of 1940, did what frightened civilians usually do when official plans prove less comforting than advertised. They looked for the safest place they could find and went there. TfL's Wartime Archive Guide notes that in early September 1940, crowds gathered outside Liverpool Street Station demanding to be allowed in, even though a 1924 government directive had ruled out the use of underground stations as air raid shelters. People bought tickets and refused to leave. By 21st September, around 120,000 people were sheltering in tube stations, and by October that had risen to 124,000. The authorities could try to manage the process, but they could no longer pretend the public would politely remain above ground if the city below seemed safer. That moment matters because it explains why London's hidden wartime shelters were both improvised and planned at once. The immediate use of stations and tunnels was a public response to fear, necessity, and common sense. The deeper shelters, by contrast, were a state response to the realisation that improvised sheltering on platforms could only go so far. According to the London Transport Museum, construction of the deep-level shelters began in 1940, with tunnels dug by hand to about 30 metres below ground and just over 400 metres in length. 8 were completed at Belsize Park, Camden Town, Good Street, Stockwell, Clapham North, Clapham Common, Clapham South, and Chancery Lane. They were purpose-built, not accidental refuge. London was now carving out a lower city specifically for endurance. The engineering was practical rather than theatrical, which somehow makes it more impressive. Historic England's listing for Clapham South describes 2 main shafts descending from the surface to a central lobby between 2 main tunnels, each 16 feet 6 inches in diameter and 1,400 feet long, with ancillary tunnels linking them and 2 levels created within each main tube. The tunnels were lined in reinforced concrete with steel fixings, and the surface entrance structures were designed to minimise flooding risk from shattered drains. Nothing in that description is trying to be poetic, and yet the image it creates is very vivid. Long, curved concrete passages deep under the ground, divided into functional levels, built to absorb human volume and wartime urgency without complaint. It is an architecture of survival, and like most such architecture, it is more honest than glamorous. Clapham South has become one of the best known of these shelters, partly because so much of it survives and partly because it still feels complete, in a way hidden places often do not. TfL says the shelter lies 180 steps below the Rotunda building near Clapham South Station, beneath the Northern Line tunnels. Historic England adds that original painted signs, iron bunks, and even graffiti from the 1940s and 1950s remain there, making it the most complete and atmospheric survivor of the deep shelters. That word atmospheric does a lot of work, and quite fairly. A place like Clapham South is not interesting only because of what happened there. It is interesting because traces remain in situ. The route down still exists. The scale is still legible. The practical language of wartime accommodation is still painted on walls. The beds are not abstract memories in a museum case. They are still where the city once expected bodies to lie. It also helps that the design of the shelter is almost absurdly sincere in its commitment to organised underground living. Historic England notes that the tunnels were divided into sections, each with a different military name, served by a canteen and 8 lavatory tunnels. That is perhaps the moment when the shelter stops feeling like a dramatic wartime cavern and starts feeling like London, because no matter how grave the emergency, eventually someone must label the sections, arrange the toilets, and work out where tea will be made. The romance of the underworld lasts right up until the point where sanitation and catering become non-negotiable. After that, one is no longer imagining a heroic refuge but a functioning overnight environment for thousands of tired people, many of whom would have been more concerned with space, warmth, noise, and queue length than with the symbolism of subterranean resilience. The broader wartime shelter experience on the underground helps us understand what that environment must have felt like, even when individual memories from Clapham South are fragmentary. TfL's wartime guide notes that 24,000 bunks were installed across stations, sidings, and newly built deep shelters. Medical and first aid posts were established, refreshment services operated underground, and by December 1940, there were 124 platform canteen points at 71 stations serving approximately 112,000 people. The same guide records the less glamorous realities too: poor toilet ratios, mosquitoes, safety rules, and the need to manage children around running trains and escalators. Over the course of the war, an estimated 63 million people took shelter in London's tube stations, all of which is a useful corrective to any temptation to imagine underground wartime life as solemn stillness. It was crowded, regulated, uncomfortable, improvised, and deeply social. It had rules, tea, complaints, infections, entertainments, and exhaustion. In other words, it was human. One of the quiet ironies of the deep shelters is that they were completed after the most intense phase of the Blitz had already passed. The London Transport Museum notes that the 8 deep-level shelters were completed in 1942, after the Blitz was over, and TfL says Clapham South was not used for its intended public shelter role until 1944, when V1 and V2 attacks intensified the bombing of London again. This timing gives the shelters a slightly strange historical position. They were conceived in urgency, built in determination, and then arrived just late enough to become available for other wartime purposes before renewed attack made at least some of them public refuges after all. That may sound inefficient, but it is really another example of how London's underground spaces accumulate multiple biographies. A shelter can be late for one emergency and still perfectly timed for the next. Some of those alternative wartime uses were remarkably consequential. The London Transport Museum notes that the Goodge Street shelter was later used by General Eisenhower, while other sources describe Chancery Lane's shelter as becoming a communications centre before its later Cold War life as the Kingsway telephone exchange. Historic England's listing for Clapham South says the deep tube shelters were developed in response to the perceived need for safe accommodation for essential services such as telephone services, government offices and military personnel, and that they were also designed with possible post-war transport reuse in mind, though that never came to pass. So even at the moment of their creation, these shelters sat in a curious overlap between civilian safety, strategic continuity, and future planning. London was not just digging places for people to survive the night, it was digging protected reserve spaces in which a threatened city could continue to function. Clapham South's later life only deepens that impression. TfL's 2015 release notes that after closing as a shelter in May 1945, it was subsequently used as a military and civilian hostel. In 1948, some of the passengers who had arrived on the HMT Empire Windrush were temporarily housed there. In 1951, during the Festival of Britain, it was again used for cheap accommodation for visitors and school children. Later it served as archive storage, and in 1998 it received Grade 2 listed status. This is one of the most moving aspects of the shelter's story. It was built for wartime survival, then became temporary lodging, in peacetime for servicemen, civilians, and some of the people who would become part of the Windrush generation's reshaping of modern Britain. The same bunks and passages that had once waited for bombed Londoners also held new arrivals at the threshold of a different national story. Hidden spaces often turn out to have unexpectedly public legacies. There is also something deeply revealing in the fact that Clapham South has retained its signs, bedsteads and graffiti. Most cities erase emergency architecture as soon as they can, either because it's painful to remember or because reused land is too valuable for sentiment. London, by contrast, often seems unable to stop repurposing its own past. A tunnel survives because it is useful, then because it is still useful, then because it might become useful again, then, at last, because its usefulness has turned into historical significance. By the time anyone fully appreciates what remains, the place has accumulated so many layers that removing it would feel like deleting evidence. Clapham South's survival is not just architectural luck. It is a consequence of living in a city where old underground spaces are rarely allowed the dignity of a single simple life. And this is why the deep shelters are so central to the mystery of subterranean London. They are not mysterious because no one knows they exist. Their locations, histories and designs can be traced. Their entrances are real. Tours even descend into some of them. The mystery lies in the overlap of functions and memories. They were public refuges, strategic reserves, engineering works, future plans that never quite happened, post-war hostels, archival stores, and historical relics, all in one compressed history. When people picture hidden wartime London, they often imagine a single bunker with stern men over maps. The truth is both more ordinary and more unsettling. Thousands of people went down those stairs. They slept, waited, talked, coughed, queued, drank tea, worried about children, and emerged in the morning hoping the street above was still there. The Undercity was not only about command, it was also about endurance in bulk. There is one more reason these shelters stay in the imagination. Depth changes how history feels. A disused platform is close enough to the everyday world that you can still imagine the train arriving. 30 metres down is different. At that depth, cut off from weather and daylight, the city above becomes something you infer rather than see. Bombing becomes vibration, rumour, timetable, waiting. The shelter is less a room under London than a temporary substitute for London. People descended into it not to visit the hidden city, but to survive while the visible one shook. That gives places like Clapham South a particular emotional weight. They are not merely secret. They are intimate records of what an urban population needed when ordinary domestic life could no longer be trusted to protect it. And yet London being London, even this great descent into wartime shelter does not sit alone in the dark. Nearby in the larger underground story are other passages with very different origins. Not emergency refugees, not sealed stations, not buried rivers, but transport routes built for another age, and then abandoned when the city changed around them. Some tunnels survived because war gave them a new job. Others survived simply because nobody found a tidy enough reason to remove them. Under central London, one of those older routes still lingers with the peculiar dignity of an obsolete solution. A tram subway under Kingsway that once carried everyday traffic below the street and now remains as another quiet reminder that this city has been building, closing, and forgetting its lower roads for far longer than most people above ever notice. Beneath central London, then, there remained not only deep shelters and sealed stations, but another kind of forgotten route altogether. A tunnel built for trams, not trains, and for ordinary movement rather than wartime emergency. The Kingsway tram subway has exactly the sort of biography that makes London's underground so difficult to summarise neatly. It was not ancient, not secret in origin, and not especially mysterious to the people who used it. It was a practical Edwardian solution to a practical transport problem, and yet because it later closed, was partly altered, partly preserved, and largely dropped from public consciousness, it now feels like one more fragment of the second city below the first. What began as a useful connector ended as a hidden survivor. Its origins lay in a moment when London still believed, with some justification that engineering could cure congestion if only it were allowed enough brick, iron and civic determination. The London County Council was reshaping parts of Holborn and Aldwych in the early 20th century, and the new Kingsway offered an opportunity to link tram systems that had previously been inconveniently separated. The subway was built by the London County Council between 1904 and 1906 as part of that wider renewal, and it opened in 1906. London Transport Museum describes it as part of an ambitious rebuilding of the Holborn and Aldwych area, while Historic England identifies it as a purpose-built tram subway from the same period. That combination of urban redevelopment and transport ambition is very characteristic of the age. London was reorganising itself at street level and, as so often happened, could not resist improving the ground below at the same time. What made the Kingsway subway unusual was not simply that it went underground, but that it did so for trams. Historic England calls the surviving northern section the only underpass specifically for trams, which gives the whole enterprise a certain lonely distinction. Britain had plenty of rail tunnels, of course, and London already had extensive subterranean transport of other kinds. But a dedicated tram subway in central London was something rather more particular. A cut-and-cover route designed to let street tramways bypass the difficulty of surface streets and connect networks more effectively. In other words, it was built for vehicles that usually belonged to the daylight city, then quietly borrowed them away from it for a short underground stretch. That oddness is part of its appeal now. It was neither fully street transport nor fully railway, but a hybrid solution in a city very fond of hybrids. At first, the subway connected trams between Bloomsbury and Aldwych, and later developments extended its significance. London Transport Museum notes that tracks laid over Westminster Bridge in 1906, together with the opening of the Kingsway subway and the subsequent network connection in 1908, allowed tram services north and south of the river to be linked. This mattered because one of the long-standing aims behind the project had been to connect London County Council's north side and south side tram systems more effectively. The route beneath Kingsway was therefore not just a curiosity under one road, it was part of a broader metropolitan logic, a way of knitting together everyday electric transport across central London. The hidden route was serving the visible city in very literal terms, carrying ordinary traffic below ground so that the larger network above could function more coherently. If all this sounds rather sensible, that is because it was. The Kingsway tram subway was not built to feel romantic a century later. It was built because transport planners wanted a through connection, and the new road alignment made one possible. That is often how London's hidden spaces begin. Nobody sets out to create atmosphere. Atmosphere arrives later, once the original use is gone, and the public is left with a surviving shell full of traces. In its working life, the subway was simply part of the city's tram system. People rode through it on their way somewhere else. Drivers guided vehicles down and back up. Passengers stood or sat and thought, one imagines, less about infrastructure than about errands, appointments, weather, and the eternal question of whether the person in front of them could please shift slightly to the left. Hidden transport is rarely mysterious while it is doing its job. Still, even in operation, the route had a peculiar physical character. Historic England's listing says the tunnel was lined with white glazed brick and retained its original cobbles and tram rails, and that the surviving entrance at Southampton Row was framed by granite cladding and iron railings. These details matter because they reveal the subway as more than a mere hole in the ground. It was infrastructure built with a certain Edwardian confidence in durable public works, practical but not entirely devoid of style. White glazed brick was common in underground environments for good reasons of cleanliness and light reflection, yet it also gives such places a distinct visual tone: hard, bright, utilitarian, and slightly clinical. Cobblestones and rails add another layer, a tactile reminder that this was a route for real vehicles grinding and humming through a carefully constructed urban interior. The remaining section is not simply a tunnel, it is a preserved texture of transport modernity. The route also changed over time, because London never leaves a transport corridor entirely alone if it can think of some improvement, compromise or adaptation to impose upon it. Historic England notes that the tunnel entrance was heightened between 1929 and 1931 to take double-decker trams. That single fact tells a whole little story about changing expectations. What had been built for one scale of vehicle now had to accept another. The city above was changing, tram technology was changing, passenger demand was changing, and so the underworld had to change as well. This is exactly the kind of incremental alteration that makes London's hidden places so layered. A tunnel is never just the tunnel of its opening year. It is also the tunnel after modifications, after operational adjustments, after policy shifts, after every generation has pressed a new requirement into its walls. For a while then, the subway remained a useful if unusual part of London's transport system. But transport systems are ruthlessly vulnerable to fashion, economics, and administrative vision. The 20th century was not kind to trams in London generally. As buses and other road vehicles took precedence, and as planners came to see trams as outdated or obstructive, the capital's tram network shrank. TfL's research guide on trolleybuses notes that by 1940, trams had already been removed from East, West and North London, apart from 3 routes that still ran through the Kingsway tram subway. That detail gives the subway a slightly wistful late phase. It was no longer the herald of a bright integrated future. It had become one of the last holdouts of an older transport order, still carrying trams through central London while the rest of the city was steadily turning away from them. When closure came, it was decisive. Historic England states that the Kingsway tram subway closed in 1952. London Transport Museum describes the remaining tunnel and station as places closed for nearly 70 years. Once the tram stopped, the route lost the purpose for which it had been dug. But, as with so many subterranean London spaces, closure did not mean immediate disappearance. The structure remained. The tunnel was still there under Kingsway. The brick, rails, cobbles, portals and station spaces did not evaporate just because policy had moved on. Instead, the subway entered the second phase common to so many buried London routes, the phase in which a no longer needed passage becomes a latent possibility, too substantial to ignore and too inconveniently placed to remove without reason. That second phase is where atmosphere begins to gather. Once a place is no longer part of daily public life, people stop understanding it through routine and start understanding it through glimpses. A sealed portal, an old photograph, a passing mention in a transport history, a rumour that there is still a station down there. The Kingsway subway acquired exactly that kind of afterlife. It was no longer traversed by ordinary Londoners on ordinary days. It became something one heard about rather than used. And because it had once served such a plainly functional purpose, the contrast made it all the more suggestive. There is something especially affecting about obsolete infrastructure that was once completely normal. A medieval crypt is expected to feel remote. A tram route under a modern city, now abandoned, feels stranger because it belonged so fully to everyday life and then slipped out of it. Part of the reason the Kingsway route remained in memory is that it was not all erased in the same way. Historic England records that the southern end was adapted as the Strand underpass in 1964 and is not included in the listed surviving northern section. This is classic London behaviour. One part of the old infrastructure is swallowed into a new scheme and continues living under a different name and purpose, while another section survives as a relic. The result is neither preservation nor destruction in pure form, but a patchwork of continuities. The tram subway did not vanish whole. It split into futures. Southward it became part of a road underpass for light traffic. Northward it lingered as a physically distinct remnant of the older system. If you were trying to invent a more London ending for such a route, you would struggle. The city kept what it could use, altered what it preferred, and left later generations to piece the story back together. This is exactly why the subway feels lost, without being truly lost. Historians can explain what happened to it. The route is known. The surviving northern section is Grade 2 listed. The south became the Strand underpass. Yet from the perspective of everyday civic memory, it still belongs to a class of places that seem half erased. You cannot ride through it as a tram passenger. Most Londoners do not think about it while walking above. Much of its old function has vanished from public experience, so it survives in that particularly intriguing zone between documented history and collective forgetfulness. It is not missing in the archaeological sense. It is missing in the habitual sense. The city no longer expects you to know it is there. There is also something about tram infrastructure specifically that lends itself to gentle melancholy. Railways often receive grand historical treatment because they are associated with national scale, stations, empires of timetable and steel. Trams, by contrast, belong to the intimate everyday city. They are close to the street, close to shops, close to crossings and neighbourhoods and ordinary errands. A tram subway therefore feels like the burial not just of a transport system, but of a particular texture of urban life. The Kingsway route is a remnant of the London that thought trams would remain central to how people move through the capital. When that vision faded, the tunnel stayed behind as evidence of a future once confidently expected and then quietly discarded. The surviving northern section has drawn attention for exactly that reason. London Transport Museum's Hidden London programme now offers tours of the Kingsway tram tunnel, describing it as the remaining tunnel and former tram station with a fascinating history. The museum's location page adds that the site had been closed for nearly 70 years. That public return is significant. It means the Kingsway subway has moved from the category of forgotten utility into the category of interpreted hidden heritage. Like Down Street or parts of Aldwych, it now participates in London's modern appetite for revealing selected pieces of the undercity, not all at once and not without supervision, but enough to let people experience the scale and texture of spaces once entirely outside public reach, and one can see why people want to go. The tunnel offers something many hidden London sites cannot quite provide on their own: a clear sense of a transport world that is both familiar and alien. Familiar because everyone understands the basic idea of trams and streets. Alien because here the trams were sent into a bright brick underworld, beneath one of central London's great roads, through a purpose-built route few cities ever attempted in quite this way. It compresses several Londons into one space: Edwardian optimism, interwar modification, post-war closure, later adaptation, heritage survival. Stand in such a place, and the city above becomes harder to think of as singular. You become aware, very quickly, that central London is not just busy but stratified, its present resting on a whole stack of choices that once seemed sensible and are now mostly invisible. The subway also demonstrates a recurring truth about underground London. Hidden spaces often begin with the least mysterious motives imaginable. No occult chamber, no lost treasure, no conspiracy of cloaked officials. Just transport planners wanting to connect routes more effectively under a newly built road. But once time passes, even the plainest purpose can acquire a kind of mystery through survival. White brick darkens, rails fall silent, portals become peculiar street furniture, names detach from their reference. The public forgets the route but retains, in a vague way, the intuition that something odd is under there. The mystery of London is rarely born mysterious. It becomes mysterious by being layered, sealed, reclassified, or merely ignored for long enough. It is also worth noticing where the Kingsway subway sits geographically, because location is part of its power. This is not some peripheral relic at the edge of the metropolis. It lies under central London, among places people still pass every day with very little suspicion. That centrality intensifies the sensation of hidden depth. The old tram route occupied ground already crowded with later systems and histories. Near it are major roads, tube lines, buried services, wartime shelters, and communications infrastructure that would soon take on lives of their own. The tunnel is therefore not merely an isolated survivor from the tram era. It is one element in a crowded underground district, where one forgotten route sits close to others that were never forgotten at all, only closed to public sight. That crowdedness is what keeps London historians cautious. It is tempting to tell the story of each tunnel as a self-contained tale: the river culvert, the deep shelter, the postal railway, the lost tram subway. But underground London is more entangled than that. The Kingsway route passed through a city core repeatedly reshaped above and below ground. One system gave way to another, and another again. A tram subway became partly a road underpass. Nearby shelter tunnels would become communications complexes. Disused transport spaces might become tour sites or technical spaces. The city does not preserve clean categories below ground any more than it does above. Instead, it accumulates adjacent purposes until the map begins to resemble a palimpsest made by civil engineers who were never told to stop. So the lost tram subway beneath Kingsway matters not only because it is unusual, though it certainly is, nor only because it is old, though it is older than most of the traffic now passing above it. It matters because it captures the exact London form of mystery, a place fully explainable in outline yet still strange in atmosphere. A place built for one obvious purpose, altered, partly erased, partly retained, and now surviving as a leftover corridor from a city that no longer organises itself that way. It is a reminder that beneath the surface, London keeps enormous practical decisions in storage. Some remain active, some are dead, some are only mostly dead, which in urban history can still mean unexpectedly available for a new use. And just a little way on from the tram subway's territory, the city below would become deeper, more secure and more guarded still. For if Kingsway preserves the memory of an everyday route that slipped out of use, the nearby tunnel world around Chancery Lane would reveal a more secretive evolution. Wartime shelter space transformed into a Cold War communications complex, the sort of underground London that was never meant to feel quaint at all. By the time London reached the Cold War, it had already become accustomed to the idea that the city below was not merely a support system for the city above. It was now a reserve of possibilities. A buried river could become drainage, a station could become a headquarters, a shelter could become accommodation, archive space, or technical infrastructure. Under Chancery Lane, that logic hardened into something more secretive and more modern. Here, one of the wartime deep-level shelters ceased to be simply a refuge in waiting, and became part of a communications world shaped by nuclear anxiety, state secrecy, and the need to keep information moving even if the surface of the capital became dangerous beyond recognition. This is why the tunnel complex under Chancery Lane feels less like a leftover and more like a hidden city. It was built in the early 1940s as part of the deep-level shelter program, around 30 metres below ground, but its later life pulled it into an entirely different story, one in which telephones, cables, switching equipment, secure links, and civil defence imagination all crowded into the same underground space. The shelter origin matters because it explains both the depth and the mood of the place. Like the other deep-level shelters, the Chancery Lane site belonged to the wartime effort to create protected underground accommodation beneath London. The London Transport Museum notes that 8 such shelters were completed, each able to accommodate around 8,000 people, and that Chancery Lane was one of them. Yet the museum also notes that the shelters were completed in 1942 after the main Blitz had passed, and the Chancery Lane shelter was instead used as a communication centre. That little twist is pure London. A structure designed to save one kind of urban life ends up preserving another. It is not the public crowd descending with blankets and flasks that defines Chancery Lane in memory, but the quieter traffic of messages, systems, documents, and technical continuity. The place had been built for endurance under bombardment, and that same endurance made it ideal for work the public was not meant to see. There is something especially revealing about that transformation. A public shelter belongs, at least in principle, to the collective city. It is there for Londoners in danger. A communications centre belongs to the managed city. the one that must keep operating no matter how frightened the public becomes. Once the Chancery Lane tunnels shifted into that second role, they ceased to be only part of wartime social history and became part of London's protected nervous system. Later accounts and redevelopment materials tie the site to wartime government communications and to the Special Operations Executive in the latter stages of the war, while also noting a long-running association with Ian Fleming and the imagined world of Q Branch. Some of that history remains shaded by the secrecy that surrounded the site, and some of it has undoubtedly been burnished by later storytelling, but the broad impression is clear enough. This was no longer simply a shelter waiting for frightened civilians. It had become one of those lower London spaces where administration, secrecy and technical work began to gather, and where the city below felt less like an emergency refuge than an alternative headquarters for history itself. After the war, the tunnel complex entered a new phase that tells you almost everything about Britain's changing priorities. In 1949, according to the official history published by the London Tunnels Project, the General Post Office took over occupation of the tunnels. That transfer sounds almost innocent, until you remember that at the time the GPO was responsible not only for the post, but for telephones as well. In other words, the state did not merely inherit a deep underground structure, it acquired a ready-made protected environment into which it could insert one of the most important systems of the modern age: telecommunications. Once that happened, the site began to move away from wartime shelter logic and toward Cold War communications logic. The shelter had been built to protect bodies from bombs. The exchange would be shaped around protecting lines, signals, switching capacity, continuity of command, and the possibility that a future crisis might not look like the last one at all. That shift from war to Cold War is one of the most important transitions in all of subterranean London. The earlier Undercity was often about surviving immediate physical danger: flooding, disease, air raids, surface congestion. The Cold War Undercity was about preserving systems through the threat of catastrophic interruption. Chancery Lane became the Kingsway complex in that spirit. The official site history says the tunnels later became the Kingsway Trunk Switching Centre, and promotional and historical materials alike describe it as a hardened communications facility beneath High Holborn near Chancery Lane. This is not merely a matter of changing labels. A switching centre is a fundamentally different kind of underground space from a shelter. It does not exist because people may need to hide there briefly. It exists because information must keep flowing. Because a state imagines a future in which broken communications may be as dangerous as broken buildings, and because a great capital cannot tolerate the idea that its voice might fail at the wrong moment. Under Chancery Lane, London had begun building not only for concealment, but for continuity under the shadow of nuclear-era fear. This is where the tunnels begin to feel truly like a second city. The hidden complex was not simply a pair of passages waiting in the dark. It became part of a much larger communications landscape, the sort of place where equipment, engineering staff, secure access, and maintenance routines mattered more than public memory. The tunnel world under Chancery Lane was large enough and important enough that later descriptions speak of a labyrinthine network, stretching for about a mile beneath Furnival Street and High Holborn, and recent coverage places the complex at around 8,000 square metres. Those figures help explain why the place feels so disproportionate to what can be seen at street level. Above ground, Chancery Lane and High Holborn are familiar central London terrain. Offices, traffic, legal London nearby, ordinary urban business. Below, however, a substantial hidden environment developed, one whose scale belonged less to a spare technical corridor and more to a concealed district of its own. London often works this way. The street gives no warning that the ground beneath it is occupied by something with its own geography, history and internal climate. The most famous communications role attached to the site concerns TAT-1, the first transatlantic telephone cable. Britannica notes that TAT-1 was laid from Clarenville in Newfoundland and reached Oban in Scotland in September 1956. with an initial capacity of 36 two-way circuits. The London Tunnel's official history says that in 1956 the Kingsway complex became home to the UK's termination point for T81. Taken together, those details place the Chancery Lane tunnels squarely inside one of the great shifts in post-war communications. The move from older, more limited long-distance systems toward a world in which transatlantic voice communication could be handled through protected, highly technical infrastructure. It is difficult now, in an age of instant global messaging, to recover the significance of that transformation. A transatlantic telephone link was not just another convenience. It altered diplomacy, commerce, military planning, news, finance, and the sheer felt closeness of powerful states. To lodge part of that system in a hardened tunnel complex under central London was to admit that communications had become one of the country's strategic organs. From there, the Cold War associations deepen. The official tunnel history states that by 1963, the Kingsway Trunk Switching Centre was used for a secure hotline connecting the White House and the Kremlin. Recent heritage and media accounts repeat the site's Cold War role as a secure communications hub, with The Guardian describing it as part of Britain's underground communications world and noting surviving features such as an artesian well intended to provide fresh water in the event of nuclear attack. It is wise to be a little careful with the more dramatic versions of these stories, because places wrapped in secrecy tend to attract bold retellings. Still, even the cautious version is extraordinary enough. Under Chancery Lane, there was a protected communications environment designed with the possibility of civilizational breakdown in mind. Freshwater underground, secure routing of calls, hardened infrastructure, continuity planning, all of it reveals a city imagining that the next emergency might require not just shelter from attack, but the preservation of command, contact, and signal in a damaged world. That is no longer simply hidden London. That is strategic London. And yet, because this is London, the severe seriousness of Cold War planning sits beside the almost comic normality of workplace life. The Guardian reports that after British Telecom took over in the 1980s, the complex included what was described as the world's deepest licensed bar, along with a staff canteen whose old fittings still survive. Visit London similarly notes the site's later reputation for housing London's deepest licensed bar. This should not be treated merely as a quirky footnote. It tells you something essential about the reality of hidden infrastructure. However strategic a place may be on paper, people still have to work there. They need breaks, food, routines, a social world, somewhere to sit with a drink after a shift, somewhere to complain about management, equipment, air quality, or the tragic state of sandwiches. One of the reasons underground London feels so rich is that its spaces were rarely purely symbolic. Even the Cold War city under Chancery Lane had office culture, human habits, and interior decor choices that would later age into unintentional comedy. Nuclear-era seriousness above the table, brown and orange bar below it. That feels entirely plausible. The secrecy surrounding the complex also helped produce precisely the kind of mystery your overall topic is interested in. The Chancery Lane and Kingsway tunnels were not unknown in the absolute sense. Officials, engineers, telecommunication staff, and certain journalists knew they were there. But for decades they occupied that especially potent middle ground between existence and visibility. They were real, significant, and largely absent from ordinary public awareness. The official tunnel history still describes them as a 70-year-old secret, which is obviously a promotional phrase but not a useless one. It captures the fact that a major underground complex can persist for generations while remaining curiously peripheral in the civic imagination. Londoners become used to the idea that the city has hidden rooms. They do not necessarily know which rooms, how large, or what they once did. That uncertainty allows places like Kingsway to attract layers of rumour, exaggeration, and half-memory without ever needing to be entirely invented. The truth is already strange enough to do most of the work. As of 2026, that hidden status is changing again. Visit London reported in February 2026 that the mile-long Kingsway exchange tunnels, about 30 metres beneath Holborn, are being transformed under a £120 million plane into a major heritage and cultural attraction, with an opening expected in early 2028. The official project history similarly lays out a timetable of public tours, construction, and a later full opening. Even here, though, the pattern remains familiar. The site is not escaping its layered history. It is simply acquiring yet another life. A wartime shelter became a communication centre. A communication centre became a Cold War switching complex. A protected technical world later passed to BT. Now it is being turned into an attraction where the public will descend precisely because the place was once hidden. London almost never uncovers a buried thing by restoring it to its original role. It uncovers by adding another role on top. The Undercity is not revealed by simplification. It is revealed by one more layer. That, in the end, is why the Cold War city under Chancery Lane matters so much in the broader story. It demonstrates that the mystery below London is not just about age. Some of the most intriguing spaces are comparatively modern. What makes them mysterious is transformation under pressure. A site built for one danger gets adapted for another. Public refuge turns into strategic secrecy. Technical necessity leaves behind atmosphere. A legal district and a busy road sit calmly above a place once imagined as crucial to communications after catastrophe. Historians can outline the sequence. Engineers can explain the systems. Planners can now package the site for visitors, and yet the emotional effect remains the same. London below ground feels like a second capital, one built not for ceremony but for contingency. And from there, the story reaches back again, because before the Cold War city and the wartime shelters and the hidden telephone exchange, London had already learned one of its most important underground lessons from an earlier century, that tunnels under great rivers could change the imagination of the city forever. Brunel understood that long before spies, switchboards and secure hotlines arrived. Long before London dug deep shelters for air raids, before it built hidden communications exchanges under Holborn, and before letters were sent through their own private underground railway, the city had already attempted something that seemed almost unreasonable. It had tried to pass beneath the Thames itself. That may not sound immediately surprising now, in a city where going under the river by train feels so ordinary that most passengers are more concerned with signal bars and whether they chose the wrong carriage. But in the early 19th century, this was a startling idea. The Thames was not merely a river. It was a busy working artery, crowded with shipping and central to the city's trade. To go under it successfully, and under soft ground rather than through solid rock, was not just a transport scheme, it was a challenge to what London thought engineering could do. The Thames Tunnel, devised by Mark Brunel and built with the help of his son Isambard Kingdom Brunel, became the first successful tunnel under a navigable river, and in doing so it opened one of the earliest true roads into London's deeper underworld. What makes the Thames Tunnel so important in the larger story is that it arrived before many of the other tunnel worlds we now associate with hidden London. It was not a tube tunnel, though it would later become part of the railway city below. It was not a sewer, though it belonged to the same broad Victorian habit of solving urban problems by descending into brick and darkness. It was not a wartime refuge or a Cold War nerve centre. It was something earlier and more daring, a deliberate attempt to create a stable passage under the river itself, where for centuries London had relied on ferries, bridges and hope. TfL's archive guide notes that the site at Rotherhithe and Wapping was chosen after the tunnel received royal assent in June 1824, and formal work began in 1825 with the sinking of the shaft at Rotherhithe and tunnelling later that year. In other words, this was not a metaphorical first road into the deep. It was an actual one, pursued by people willing to dig below one of the city's most important waters and trust that ingenuity might hold back disaster. The central technical idea was Brunel's tunnelling shield, and it is difficult to overstate how consequential that was. TfL's research guide describes the shield as an iron frame divided into cells, each occupied by a single miner, allowing them to excavate small areas of the tunnel face, while the shield protected them and was then pushed forward by jacks. That concept, the guide notes, forms the basis of tunnelling work today, although with more advanced technology. It is one of those moments in engineering history that feels almost suspiciously neat in retrospect. A city needs to get through impossible ground. An inventor creates a method. The method changes what later generations consider normal. Of course, in practice, nothing about the Thames tunnel was neat. It was slow, wet, dangerous, ruinously expensive and beset by setbacks. But the shield mattered because it turned a fantasy into something that could at least be attempted systematically, rather than heroically improvised. London's later underground confidence would owe a great deal to that first act of disciplined stubbornness. The dangers were real almost immediately. TfL's guide says the project was beset with problems from the start, with flooding a frequent threat because it was the first known tunnel under a navigable river. The first major flood came in 1827, after 549 feet of tunnelling had been completed. Then in 1828 came a second major flood, in which 6 men were killed, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel was badly injured. The Brunel Museum's account of the 1828 flood says that it nearly killed him as well. These details matter because the tunnel can sound, from a modern distance, like a serene triumph of Victorian vision. It was not serene at all. It was a prolonged contest with water, unstable ground, and the simple fact that the river above had no intention of cooperating. Men worked in foul air, while sewage-laden river water leaked into the workings, according to TfL, and methane was present as well. One does not need to dramatise those conditions. They are already dramatic enough. There is a temptation, when writing about famous engineering works, to glide past the ugly parts and linger only on the moment of completion. But the ugly parts are often what explain why a place later acquires so much emotional weight. The Thames tunnel was not simply impressive because it existed. It was impressive because for years it seemed only intermittently possible that it ever would. After the disasters of the late 1820s, the tunnel was bricked up in August 1828, when a new issue of shares failed to raise enough money, according to TfL. Work effectively stalled. Only in 1834, when part of a treasury loan was made to the Thames Tunnel Company, did the project regain the means to continue. The new shield was installed and tunnelling restarted in 1835. Further floods followed in 1837 and 1838, before the North Shore was finally reached and the Wapping shaft acquired in 1840. This was not a clean arc of progress. It was a stop-start struggle stretching over years, expensive enough to become the butt of metropolitan humour and stubborn enough to continue anyway. That long uncertainty is one reason the tunnel feels like such an important threshold in London's underground story. A buried river like the Fleet had been forced below through cumulative urban change. Sewers would later rationalise the movement of foul water on a huge scale. But the Thames tunnel was different. It was a conscious leap. Mark Brunel was not tidying up an existing nuisance. He was trying to create a new route where none had previously been possible. The ambition was extraordinary, and so was the intended use. TfL's archive guide says the tunnel was originally intended for the passage of freight serving the adjacent London docks as well as for pedestrians. It was not meant merely as a novelty. It was supposed to be a practical commercial link, part of a working city. Even at this early stage then, London's descent below ground was tied not just to shelter or concealment, but to movement, trade, and the reduction of friction in an overburdened metropolis. Yet when the tunnel was finally completed in 1841 and opened to the public in March 1843, it did not function quite as originally imagined. The wide spiral roadway approaches that would have allowed horse-drawn traffic were never built. TfL notes, and access remained via long stairways at both ends. That made it less practical for the freight and carriage purposes its promoters had once imagined. Instead, the tunnel opened to pedestrian traffic, with a toll of 1 penny. During the first 24 hours, according to TfL, 10,000 people paid to enter, and the total number of visitors reached 1 million by the following July. This tells you something lovely and slightly mischievous about London. Even when a grand engineering scheme failed to achieve its original transport purpose, the city was perfectly happy to turn up and pay to walk through it anyway. It had become an attraction, a wonder, a place to see and be seen in the underworld. And it really was an underworld in the public imagination. TfL says the tunnel was lined with alcoves and occupied from the start by traders selling refreshments, souvenirs, and other goods, while annual fancy fairs brought musicians, dancers, and entertainers into the space. The Brunel Museum notes on its homepage that the Brunels even hosted the first underwater concert party there in 1827 during construction. There is something almost absurdly charming about that. London had spent years wrestling mud, water, gas, and financial collapse beneath a river, and one of the cultural responses was to hold entertainment below the Thames. This is either proof of the city's resilience, or proof that no one in London can encounter a remarkable space without eventually wondering whether it might also host music and refreshments. Probably both. In any case, the tunnel's early life as a pedestrian spectacle matters because it helped cement the idea that what lay below could be publicly fascinating, not merely technically useful. Hidden London was beginning to acquire an audience. Its popularity as a wonder did not last forever. TfL records that by the late 1850s the tunnel had lost its appeal and was becoming run down. This too is a very urban fate. Today's marvel is tomorrow's slightly shabby passage where the novelty is worn off and the maintenance budget is looking anxious. But the tunnel story did not end there. On the contrary, it entered one of the most important transformations in all of subterranean London. In 1865, the East London Railway Company was incorporated to connect railways north and south of the Thames, and the tunnel was sold for railway use. TfL says it opened to London Brighton and South Coast Railway trains in December 1869. The old pedestrian wonder became an actual transport artery after all, though not in the manner first intended. By then, much of its earlier architectural character had been obscured or altered, and Wapping Station was constructed in the original entrance shaft. A public curiosity was absorbed into the serious machinery of urban movement. That conversion is one of the most London developments imaginable. A place begins as a grand experiment, becomes a tourist sensation, slides towards seediness, and is then repurposed as railway infrastructure. One can almost hear the city muttering that sentiment is all very well, but a tunnel under the Thames really ought to be doing something useful. Once rail took over, the Thames Tunnel became part of a larger story of the East London Railway, and later the Underground Network. TfL's guide traces its extensions and connections in the late 19th century, its electrification in 1913, and its incorporation into the underground system with the formation of the London Passenger Transport Board in 1933. Later it became the East London Line, closed for refurbishment in 1995, reopened in 1998, and then closed again in 2007 before reopening in 2010 as part of the London Overground Network. That is an astonishingly long-working afterlife for a structure whose first public opening came in 1843. It did not merely survive, it kept being folded into new Transport Londons. This long reuse is one reason the tunnel matters so much to your broader idea of layered mystery. Historians can explain the main sequence well enough. The dates are known, the engineering is documented, the conversion to rail is well traced. And yet the Thames Tunnel still feels bigger in the imagination than a list of dates can capture. That is because it contains multiple Londons at once. It is an early 19th century engineering gamble, a place of repeated flood and fatal risk, a pedestrian spectacle, a seedy attraction, a railway tunnel, an underground route, a London overground corridor, and a heritage site connected to the Brunel Museum. It is never merely one thing for very long. That makes it emblematic of the city below as a whole. Beneath London, the mystery is rarely about a place having no known history. It is about having too many histories pressed into the same brick shell. There is also a geographical reason the Thames Tunnel carries such symbolic power. It links Rotherhithe and Wapping under the river itself. Above, the Thames was long the great divider and connector of London, shaping trade, identity and movement. To pass below it rather than over it altered more than transport. It altered imagination. Once one tunnel under the river could be achieved, later generations no longer had to treat the ground beneath the Thames as a forbidden zone. The city's confidence changed. Today there are many crossings under the river, but the first successful tunnel beneath a navigable river changed the terms of what London could think possible. TfL's 2010/11 annual report even describes the Victorian achievement as building the first tunnel under the Thames. The wording is almost casual, which is perhaps the surest sign of success. What once seemed outrageous eventually becomes a line in a transport summary. And still, if you look at the story slowly, the old drama returns. Flooding, foul air, financial collapse, a son nearly drowned, workers killed, years lost, then completion, applause, crowds, trade, decline, conversion, electrification, preservation, reopening. It is almost too much history for one tunnel, which is precisely why it feels like the correct place to stand before stepping back and considering London as a whole. The Thames Tunnel is not the oldest thing under the city, nor the deepest, nor the most secret. But it is one of the clearest early moments when London decided that the answer to a surface problem might lie in making habitable space beneath what seemed impossible ground. Once that decision had been proven feasible, however painfully, the future under city became much easier to imagine. It also helps explain why so many later underground places in London carry a faint Brunelian aftertaste, even when they have nothing directly to do with Mark Brunel himself. The larger habit is the same: a challenge above, an engineered descent below, a hidden route that eventually becomes ordinary. The Thames Tunnel taught London, in practical form, that the deep city could be built. After that came railways under streets, great sewer systems, culverted rivers, tram subways, sealed stations, shelters, exchanges, and all the rest of the layered maze. Some of those later places are more mysterious in the popular sense. Some are easier to tour, easier to romanticize, easier to turn into television. But Brunel's tunnel remains the foundational gesture, the first large modern proof that London could carve itself a second geography and then live with it. And perhaps that is why the tunnel still feels less like a finished monument than a beginning. Even now, the Brunel engine house at Rotherhithe, built to house the pumps for draining the tunnel, survives as the Brunel Museum, while the route itself continues as part of London Overground. The old shaft forms part of the museum, and walking tours are arranged on occasions according to TfL. So the place still does what Hidden London often does best. It continues operating in one register, while inviting curiosity in another. Commuters pass through part of the Brunel's achievement as a routine journey. Visitors descend into its history as an act of wonder. A tunnel that began as an impossible dream remains embedded in ordinary life. That is a very London ending, or rather not an ending at all, because under this city endings are usually just one more form of reuse. And once, Brunel's first road into the deep had shown what could be done. London would go on doing it again and again, until the underworld beneath the capital was no longer a single marvel, but a crowded accumulation of rivers, stations, shelters, tram routes, service passages, and sealed rooms so densely layered that the real mystery was no longer whether they existed, but how any one story could ever contain them all. When people say London's tunnels are mysterious, they do not usually mean that every passage beneath the city is unknown, uncharted, or waiting for a Victorian detective with a lantern and unresolved family issues. In many cases, the opposite is true. Quite a lot is known, Engineers know where active systems run. Historians know when many tunnels were built, what they were for and how they changed over time. Archaeologists know that inner London sits on an exceptional build-up of buried remains created by nearly 2,000 years of dense occupation, redevelopment, destruction and rebuilding. Historic England describes London as a city of great urban time depth, where intensive occupation has created archaeological deposits of international significance below the modern streets. And yet the mystery persists, because knowledge in London is rarely neat. A buried feature is seldom just one thing. The remains of the Roman riverside wall, for example, still survive in situ underground beneath modern buildings along Upper and Lower Thames Street, and Historic England notes that each redevelopment helps archaeologists piece together a larger picture of Roman and later London. That is very nearly the definition of the city below. Not one hidden world, but a patchwork of partial revelations assembled from fragments, exposed whenever the modern city cuts into the old one. London does not uncover its past in one grand gesture. It reveals it bit by bit, usually when someone is trying to build something else. That is why the deeper city feels so difficult to summarize. It is not a single underworld with one date, one purpose, or one mood. It is a stack of competing solutions. Rivers were buried or channelized as urban development displaced older valleys and floodplains. London's own environmental planning documents note that the floodplain belts of the tributaries, including the lost rivers of central London, were largely displaced by development, and that most smaller streams were built over and channelized. A river such as the Fleet, therefore, does not vanish cleanly. It becomes part geography, part drainage, part historical memory, and part civic unease, whenever heavy rain reminds the city that water still has opinions. Then come the layers humans added more deliberately. The Thames Tunnel opened the possibility of passing beneath what had once seemed impossible ground, and later became part of the rail network. The world's first underground railway began operating in 1863, and London went on expanding subterranean transport from there. The Kingsway tram subway provided a rare dedicated underpass for trams before closing in 1952, while the Post Office Railway, later known as Mail Rail, ran from 1927 to 2003 as a private electric line carrying post through 6.5 miles of tunnel beneath the city. Each of those routes belonged to a different answer to the same urban question. If the surface is crowded, unreliable, or inconvenient, what can be moved below instead? Some underground spaces, of course, became mysterious precisely because they stopped serving the public and started serving everyone else. Down Street closed to passengers in 1932, then was converted in 1939 into a protected headquarters for the Railway Executive Committee during the Second World War because it was disused, central, and 22 metres underground. Other disused stations and tunnels found wartime roles too, from sheltering civilians to storing artworks and supporting command functions. London Transport Museum's Hidden London programme now makes a few of these places visitable, but the fascination comes from the same source it always has. A public place loses its public purpose and acquires a second life behind closed doors. The city keeps the shell, changes the use, and leaves later generations to discover that closure did not mean emptiness after all. The deep-level shelters make the point even more clearly. Built around 30 metres below ground and completed in 1942, they were intended to hold thousands of people in protected twin tunnels, yet some arrived too late for the worst of the Blitz, and were instead adapted for communications, military, or later civilian purposes. Clapham South later housed some of the Empire Windrush arrivals in 1948. Chancery Lane's shelter evolved into a communications site and then into the Kingsway complex, associated with secure telephone infrastructure and Cold War continuity planning. A shelter in London can begin as a place for frightened civilians, become a technical centre, then reappear decades later as heritage, redevelopment opportunity, or urban legend. That is not a failure of history. It is the history. And this is where the real reason for the mystery begins to come into focus. The hidden London beneath the streets is not obscure because it was all classified, though some of it was. It is obscure because it was cumulative. One generation buries a stream, another builds a sewer, another drives a railway through nearby ground, another seals a station, another converts shelter space into a switching centre, another discovers Roman masonry beneath an office redevelopment and leaves it in place under a modern building. Historic England's work on the Roman riverside wall makes exactly this point in practical form. Roman, medieval, and later structures survive together below today's city. A new excavation rarely reveals a simple story. It reveals overlap. Cities that rebuild from scratch can sometimes tell cleaner stories about themselves. London is not one of those cities. Despite fire, bombing, reconstruction and modernisation, its development has been more additive than absolute. The Museum of London Archaeology's overview of Greater London describes evidence ranging from prehistoric sites to Roman, Saxon, medieval, and later remains across the metropolis, while Historic England emphasises that Inner London's dense occupation has produced a remarkable concentration of buried archaeological material. Put more plainly, the city has spent centuries dropping one age onto another and then acting surprised whenever a basement project discovers that history has not cleared the site properly. That layered condition also changes how rumour works. In some cities, wild tunnel stories remain wild because there is not much real buried infrastructure to support them. In London, rumour has a far easier job because reality is already crowded with hidden things. There really are disused stations. There really are lost rivers. There really are wartime shelters, service passages, utility ducts, buried archaeological remains, and transport tunnels from multiple eras. So when a sealed doorway appears in a corridor or an old shaft is mentioned in conversation, people do not have to imagine very far. The city has trained them to expect that some unlikely underground story may turn out to be at least partly true. Even Historic England's discussion of the Roman riverside wall remarks that, in a city as dense as London, and built up over 2,000 years, there are still mysteries to be revealed right beneath our feet. There is also the simple matter of access. A city can preserve knowledge in archives and plans, but most people do not experience a place as fully real until they can stand in it. The underground resists that. Active tunnels are not tourist footpaths, which is fair enough. Sewer routes do not generally welcome reflective strolls. Secure communication sites are not improved by surprise visitors. So the public understanding of hidden London has long depended on partial glimpses. Old maps, engineering drawings, official tours, photographs, redevelopment reports, hearsay, and the occasional news story. Even now, the popular fascination around hidden London tours is built on the idea of stepping behind the scenes into disused tunnels, forgotten platforms and wartime spaces that normally remain out of sight. When access is limited, imagination does a great deal of the decorating, and imagination thrives especially well when the surface looks so composed. London above ground often presents itself as established, dignified and almost stubbornly functional. Offices open, buses pass, cafes fill, lawyers hurry through Holborn, tourists photograph the city. Somewhere under all that, Roman wall sections sit beneath modern buildings, old tributary valleys persist in the ground, and tunnel systems from the 19th and 20th centuries continue to intersect with utilities and transport. The mystery is sharpened by that contrast. A city that appeared visibly chaotic at every turn would not generate the same effect. London's peculiar gift is that it can look entirely settled while resting on an astonishing amount of unfinished historical business. This is why the phrase, "a second London," is useful, provided we do not take it too literally. There is no single underground capital mirroring the streets above in perfect miniature. No complete hidden map waiting in a drawer marked "Do not open unless curious." What exists instead is a second London in the sense of accumulated urban life below the surface. Channels, shafts, rails, vaults, culverts, shelters, cellars, foundations, conduits, stations, and sealed rooms produced by different centuries for different reasons. Some remain active, some survive as relics, some have been turned to new purposes, some are only revealed when development forces the city to look at itself again. The second London is real, but it is untidy, crowded, and assembled over time rather than designed as a whole. There is something almost reassuring in that. We often talk about cities as though they should make complete sense if only we had the right guidebook. But large old cities do not work like that, and London least of all. London makes sense locally, by era, by tunnel, by project, by crisis. It makes less sense when you demand one clean explanation for everything at once. A buried river belongs to hydrology, sanitation, and urban expansion. A disused station belongs to transport history, wartime planning, and heritage interpretation. A Cold War tunnel belongs to telecommunications, government anxiety, and later redevelopment. Even a Roman wall beneath an office block belongs to archaeology, construction pressure, and the stubborn inconvenience of time itself. Historians can explain each piece very well. The difficulty comes when the pieces insist on touching. And perhaps that is the proper answer to the title of our journey. Historians still cannot fully explain London's tunnels in the singular because there is no singular object to explain. There are tunnels, plural, and chambers, and shafts and roots and buried remains, each entering the story at a different moment and often refusing to leave when their first purpose ends. The mystery is not ignorance so much as density. Too many uses, too many eras, too many overlapping solutions built into the same ground. London is mysterious below not because nobody knows anything, but because knowing one layer rarely settles the others. The more you learn, the less the city resembles a puzzle with one solution, and the more it resembles a filing system designed by centuries of emergencies. So if you were to walk through London tomorrow and wonder what sits below your feet, the honest answer would be both precise and unhelpfully large. Perhaps a buried watercourse, perhaps a Victorian sewer or utility line, perhaps railway infrastructure in active use, perhaps the sealed remains of an older station, perhaps nothing more dramatic than foundations and ducts, or perhaps, not far away, Roman masonry preserved in situ under a modern office, the remains of a wall older than the language of the traffic passing above. That is the charm of it. The city does not reveal itself all at once. It lets the surface get on with its day while the older and deeper London continues below, carrying water, holding records, preserving traces, and occasionally allowing a little of its story back into view. And now we arrive at the quiet end of this descent, or perhaps just the point where we stop digging for the night. We've followed buried rivers, wartime shelters, tram tunnels, sealed stations, postal trains, communications caverns, and Brunel's first brave route beneath the Thames. We've seen that what lies under London is not one lost world, but many, stacked so tightly that the city above can never be the whole story. If you're listening somewhere far from London, I hope the place around you now feels just a little deeper than it did before, and if you happen to be in London itself, perhaps the next pavement, station entrance, office block or ordinary stretch of road will seem slightly less ordinary. Because beneath some cities there is infrastructure. Beneath London there is also memory, accident, reuse, survival, and the long habit of building over what was never truly gone. Sleep well, wherever you are, and mind the layers.